The founding of Rome traces back to the legend of Troy and a hero named Aeneas, a Trojan who fled destruction and sailed the sea in search of a new home. But we don't have time for that. Jesus, did you see the timestamp on this video? Roman Empire, that means we start with the emperors. So let's run down the classic rise of Augustus and fall of the Republic story, shall we? Because the most interesting part of Augustus's life is definitely before he became emperor. Rome had always been and would always be a bit of a dumpster fire, but it was the eternal dumpster fire. The dumpster fire that refused to go out. For centuries, the Republic had managed to survive that dumpster fire through countless wars and political crises. However, for like 100 years before Augustus, the dumpster fire was really starting to become a problem, because every generation, some military strongman would come out of the woodwork, fight a civil war with another military strongman, and make himself a dictator. First, it was this guy Sulla, who purged all of his political enemies. Then Julius Caesar comes along and tries not purging all of his political enemies, and then his political enemies stabbed him to death. The main masterminds behind the assassination were Brutus and Cassius. They want to return power to the Senate, and generally all the people who aren't Julius Caesar. But the genie was very much out of the bottle. Something had to give. Somebody had to turn chaos back into order, and that somebody was Augustus. Augustus, at this point, is a nobody. Caesar was his great uncle, whom he had met like twice. Augustus hadn't even finished military training, but he went on a crazy mission across enemy lines just to talk to Caesar. So he left enough of an impression that the childless Caesar decided to make Augustus his heir. And now, Augustus was coming to Rome to collect. At the time, the biggest name in the city was Mark Antony. In a lot of ways, Mark Antony would have felt like the next Caesar, even if he wasn't related to him. Antony had been on campaign with Caesar. He'd learned from Caesar. He was close to Caesar. He was like Caesar's right-hand guy. Antony had entered into a very unsteady alliance with Caesar's assassins to try to keep the peace, but the peace was fleeting. Antony ended up chasing Brutus and Cassius out of town at Caesar's funeral. The story goes he made this impassioned speech where, if you believe Shakespeare, technically he never told anyone to attack Brutus and Cassius, for they are honorable men. But also, don't we all love Caesar? And wasn't Caesar really great, actually? And didn't Brutus and Cassius kill him in cold blood? But they are honorable men. So while all of that is going on, Augustus is cashing in on Caesar's fortune and using it not just to get rich beyond his wildest dreams, but to make friends with the army. Rome isn't really big enough for two military strongmen, so Augustus and Antony get into a fight. Augustus ends up in control of the city of Rome, and the Senate try to use sneaky political machinations to use the fight between Augustus and Antony to empower themselves, but every time they put their foot down on anything Augustus does, Augustus reminds them that he is the one with the army, and not them. At a certain point, though, Antony and Augustus put their differences aside, hold hands, kill some senators, they marry each other's relatives, they kill Brutus and Cassius. Honestly, the hardest part wasn't even killing Brutus and Cassius, it was trying to keep their own armies fed and paid. But after Brutus and Cassius are gone, Augustus and Antony have no one else to fight except for each other. They entertained themselves for a little bit, fighting with the pirate king of Sicily, but that only lasted a few years, and they both kind of know they're going to end up fighting each other eventually. Antony's ex-wife had even gone as far as kickstarting the war against Augustus, but Antony wasn't ready yet. Antony's plan is to gamble on winning a war against Persia to make himself super rich and super popular, but then he loses. He now really needs some extra soldiers to bolster his army, so he divorces his current wife, who was Augustus's sister, and marries the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. Cleopatra was one smart cookie. She had finally won her family's game of Snog, Marry, Kill and made Egypt relevant for the first time in a long time, but she was not a Roman. She wasn't really an Egyptian either. She was technically Greek, but That was enough for Augustus. Augustus takes this anti-Romanness and runs with it. He rises up half of the empire, talking about how Antony has been corrupted by the East. He's a weak man who has been charmed by the witchy Queen of Egypt. They fight, Augustus wins, Antony and Cleopatra both die. Augustus consolidates power, quote-unquote returns power to the Senate, actually makes himself an emperor, and then rules in peace for like 40 years, which by Roman standards is incredible. Because after all, Augustus couldn't live forever, and it only took another 50 years after his death before the city of Rome was on fire again. To steal a line from Game of Thrones, every time a member of Augustus's family was born, the gods flipped a coin. Half of Augustus's family were living legends, steadfast, capable of anything, beloved by everyone who knew them. And the other half were completely deranged. Augustus had a grandson, for instance, who would have been his heir, but the kid turned out to be a horrible little gremlin child who got himself exiled. But there was a solution. Rome was a society where adult adoption was pretty normal. If you were an emperor, you could pretty much make anyone your heir, so meritocracy was very much on the table, and Augustus was all about picking the best emperor. But the universe seemed determined to guide the Roman Empire towards the worst emperors possible. Augustus first settled on his best general to be his successor, and then he died. So Augustus was going to give the empire to his stepson, who then dies. So Augustus adopts his stepson's 3 sons, and then 2 of them die. In the end, the only choice left was Tiberius, a man who had previously exiled himself because he so desperately did not want to be involved in politics. But hey, maybe that's a good thing. Let's look how his reign went down. Tiberius spends his entire reign rolling his eyes at everyone's BS. Because Augustus was this larger-than-life figure who seemingly had the answer to everything and always kept the Senate happy, the Senate, over the course of Augustus's 40 years, had devolved into a bunch of children. Whenever a senator wanted something, he told Tiberius that Tiberius was so brave and cool and awesome, and he would be the awesomest if he gave them a toy. Whenever anyone said something bad about Tiberius in public, the senators would be like a cat with a bird. They'd kill the person and bring him to Tiberius as a present, even though Tiberius repeatedly told them to stop killing people for him. Whenever 2 senators got into a fight, they cried, "Dad!" and ran to Tiberius to tattle on each other. A senator literally came to Tiberius, the emperor, to complain that another senator was sitting in his spot during the gladiator games. This is what the daily life of an emperor looked like. Tiberius was actively trying to give the Senate more power by letting them choose things, but they only wanted to choose the thing that Tiberius wanted. So they made Tiberius do all of their homework for them. Tiberius was also ready to start giving power to a successor, and he had some great options. His nephew was a war hero who mastered the wild lands of Germany, and he died. Tiberius made his son Drusus the heir and made him babysit the Senate while Tiberius ran away to his vacation house. But the guy who really took advantage of Tiberius not wanting to be in charge anymore was the captain of the royal guard named Sejanus. Sejanus was the other guy Tiberius was offloading all of his work to, and Sejanus would really like to be the only guy. As a matter of fact, Sejanus has some beef with Drusus being the heir because Sejanus wants to be the heir, because Sejanus wants to be the emperor real bad. So Sejanus comes up with a little lie. Sejanus tells Tiberius that Drusus is trying to poison him. So when Drusus offers Tiberius a cup of wine that Sejanus had poisoned, I guess, Tiberius orders Drusus to drink it himself. Now, Drusus isn't planning to poison Tiberius. He has no idea that Tiberius even suspects him. Drusus just thinks it's wine o'clock. So he gulps it down and falls over dead. And Tiberius is shocked. He thinks that his son has just accepted the most metal death sentence ever. Then, Sejanus just starts tearing through all of Tiberius's heirs, convincing Tiberius that they're all trying to kill him, and only once they are all dead, and Sejanus starts asking Tiberius nicely if he could marry into the family, only then does Tiberius realize he maybe shouldn't have killed his entire family. So Sejanus is killed, but now the only viable heir in all of Rome is this poor traumatized kid who just watched his entire family get murdered. That kid grew up to be Emperor Caligula. Caligula is only emperor number 3 out of like 300, and he still manages to be one of the worst ever. When Caligula comes to power, everyone is very excited to have an emperor who's not murdering people all the time, and then he started killing a bunch of people, except this time without trials. He then crashed the Roman economy, partially by building a palace on top of a boat, but partially by bribing a bunch of unhappy aristocrats so that they wouldn't kill him. Why did they want to kill him? Well, maybe it was because he spent a lot of time calling himself the god Jupiter and carving off the faces of gods and goddesses around town and replacing them with his own face. Maybe it was throwing the crowds into the arena during wild animal fights, or maybe it was the one about declaring war on the ocean, but that one's probably a myth. Then again, there was the one with his business of treating his horse like a senator. But what got Caligula killed in the end was not economically devastating the empire or flagrantly disrespecting its most sacred customs. Oh no, Rome could tolerate that. What actually got him killed was bringing back elections. This wasn't out of a love for democracy, he did it more to stick it to the aristocracy. The aristocracy was indeed stuck, and predictably, they stuck back with swords. R.I.P. Caligula. The royal family was really running low on heirs at this point, so they pulled out this guy Claudius, who was never supposed to have power. He had a limp and was hard of hearing, so the royal family kept him around just to bully him, but today was his lucky day. And this time, the coin came up the other way. Claudius turns out to be a really solid emperor. Lots of new infrastructure. He successfully conquers Britain when Julius Caesar himself could not. But Claudius had terrible luck with marriage. Claudius's first wife cheated on him and may have done a murder. Second wife just didn't work out politically. Third wife cheated on him with every guy in town and might also have tried to murder him in like a coup or something. Supposedly, that last little scare made Claudius realize there was a very easy way to stop the next coup. Aside from Claudius's son, the only other person with a claim to the throne was a little boy named Nero, whose mother, Agrippina, was just a little too smart to be left alone. So, Claudius married Agrippina, adopted Nero, made Nero his heir, and now Agrippina can't coup him to put Nero in charge. Agrippina then probably murdered Claudius to put Nero in charge. Nero is probably the Roman emperor with the worst reputation of all time, which I think is only partially deserved. He probably didn't light Rome on fire and fiddle as it burned. Actually, the fiddle didn't exist yet, so he probably didn't do that. But call him Billy Joel because he didn't start the fire either. Probably. If you were an ordinary Roman citizen, Nero was the guy who rebuilt Rome after the fire and spent a bunch of money on arts and culture. He was less fun if you were Christian, but then there weren't a lot of emperors in those days who were good for Christians. The people Nero was exceptionally bad for were everyone in his court. Nero had this weird love-hate relationship with his mom, which was probably 70% hate because they both wanted to rule the empire. In order to take the empire away from Nero, Agrippina tries to give it to his stepbrother, Claudius's son, who got overlooked in favor of Nero. And then Nero kills the kid. And then he kills his mother, and then he kills a whole bunch of other people, and beats his pregnant wife to death, and then castrated one of his slaves, dressed him up like his dead wife, and abused him for bedroom activities. May have assaulted the pagan equivalent of a nun, too. Freud would have had a field day with this kid. The empire then proceeds to get a little bit Looney Tunes in what we call the Year of the Four Emperors. That's not even counting Nero, by the way. So in AD 68, this guy in France named Vindex, or as the Romans would actually have called him, Windex, who loved washing windows or something, decides he's had enough of Nero and leads a revolt. Windex doesn't even want to be emperor. He never claims to be emperor. He is completely open to anyone else being emperor as long as they're not Nero. Windex's rebellion is off to a rough start. Nero hasn't even sent in the army yet, and Windex has to besiege the capital of his own province because all the people loved Nero. Nero, heart and soul. That's the crazy thing. If you were anyone who had direct contact with Nero, you knew he was an unpredictable, violent psychopath, but the Roman Empire somehow was not seriously impacted by such things. No matter how much of a burning trash fire the royal court was, Rome just kept chug-a-luggin'. And for the average person in the empire, Nero's reign was a positive. He was so beloved that after his death, 3 different people pretended to be him, thinking that they could ride his coattails all the way to becoming emperor. So Vindex is in the process of recapturing his own territory when Nero's army finally arrives. Nero isn't there personally. He doesn't lead armies. He's back in Rome, probably admiring his 100-foot naked statue of himself, or polishing the gold medal he gave himself when he declared himself the winner of the new art competition in the Olympics. The person in charge of the army that's coming to deal with Vindex is some general. Vindex has a sit-down with Nero's general and convinces him that Nero isn't worth saving, and that they should both support this Spanish governor named Galba. Except whoops, Nero's army attacked anyway, without orders from their general, and killed Vindex. And when their general pointed out the big whoopsie they made, they suggested that maybe he should be emperor and go to war with this Galba guy too. The general decided this whole thing was stupid and he was going to wait for it all to blow over. So, a weakened Galba, without the support of Vindex or this other guy, is now leading the rebellion, but he is still very successful and shows up at Nero's doorstep in Rome. Nero has no idea what to do. He doesn't know if he wants to run away to Egypt, or maybe see if Persia will take him, or just surrender to Galba, and it's really hard to think because his officers are making fun of him for not wanting to die. By the time Galba arrives, Nero finds himself completely alone. Everyone around him has just abandoned him and run off. And so Nero finally falls on his own sword, crying, "Alas, what an artist dies in me." Galba then becomes the new emperor, and in a matter of months makes 2 fatal mistakes. Firstly, he decides to intentionally install the most incompetent people he can find into positions of power so that they won't come after him. One of these guys was named Vitellius. Vitellius was famous for being very broke and very fat. Galba's whole plan was that Vitellius would never cause any problems because he would be incapable of thinking about anything other than food. Turns out no, Vitellius thinks quite a lot about becoming emperor actually, and he is in fact better at winning battles than Galba is. Galba then panics, and I guess for extra authority or to make his army bigger or just a backup plan or something, he names a successor. But ooh, that turns out to be mistake number 2. You see, it turns out this guy named Otho really wanted to be Galba's successor, and now he's feeling snubbed. Whatever will he do? Otho finds out Galba hasn't been paying the royal guard. The same royal guard that have so much power they nearly usurped Rome's 2nd ever emperor, murdered its 3rd ever emperor, and chose its 4th ever emperor. Otho decides to actually pay the royal guard, and they decide to make Otho the emperor. Galba's gone, Otho's in charge. Problem: Vitellius is still rebelling, and now that's Otho's problem. Otho tries to make an alliance by marrying Vitellius's daughter, but Vitellius says no. Otho tries to share the empire with Vitellius. Vitellius says no. Otho decides he's had a good run, and he kills himself. But we're still not done! Vitellius is on the throne, but there is a new challenger who wants to be emperor, and his army is even better than Vitellius's army. Vitellius, oh, this is good. Vitellius surrenders, but his army says no. Vitellius, the emperor, is literally ordering his men to not fight. And they tell him no, he is the emperor, he can do anything he wants except surrender. And so they fight, and so they die. Vitellius is found hiding in some dark corner, dragged through the street, and beaten to death. Don't you just hate when that happens to you? Anyway, that was the year of the 4 emperors. The guy who killed Vitellius and stepped in as the new adult in the room is Vespasian. He is the start of a new dynasty called the Flavians. Flavians. They are perhaps most famous for building the Flavian Amphitheater, otherwise known as the Colosseum. And do you know why they call it the Colosseum? It's not because it's big, it's because Nero's 100-foot-tall statue of himself, otherwise known as Nero's Colossus, got moved in front of it. Vespasian ruled for 10 years. He brought law and order back to Rome. He gave the empire to his son Titus instead of adopting. Titus was only emperor for 2 years, but somehow managed to finish the Colosseum, destroy the Jewish Second Temple, and roast marshmallows over the volcanic ruins of Pompeii. When he died, his little brother stepped up to the throne, and he was good. Emperor was chugging along for 15 years. Dude was an authoritarian, but the people had their bread in circuses. Actually, this time period, or at least really close to it, is where the expression about bread and circuses to keep people happy comes from. It comes from a Roman author talking about how the proud Roman people didn't care about political involvement anymore as long as they had bread and circuses. And I guess he was right. The one group that Titus's little bro was not popular with, however, was the government. The ship he ran was a little too tight for their liking, and his officials killed him and stuck one of his advisors on the throne. Thus begins one of Rome's most famous dynasties, commonly known as the Five Good Emperors. I love that the longest Rome could make it without either killing their emperor or getting a really bad one was 5 in a row. If you were living in ancient Rome, you were virtually guaranteed to live through at least one horrible emperor. What made these guys so good was that these guys just picked a guy in their administration who was good at doing work, adopted him, and made him their heir. The first of the 5 good emperors was Nerva, and he hardly counts because he ruled for less than a year before dying. Great guy, I assume, but we don't have time to care. Next is Trajan, and Trajan is peak Rome. First of all, this was a great time to be a Roman. Rome was hella rich, and Trajan was spending a bunch of money on social welfare programs. The Senate was having such a good time, they named him Optimus Princeps, literally the best emperor. They told everybody that this guy deserves to go at the very top of the tier list. Trajan's reign was also the biggest Rome ever got, which is where all that money came from, conquering and subjugating and enslaving people and stealing a whole bunch of gold. You've got the whole Mediterranean Sea. Almost all of the Black Sea belongs to Rome at this point. They're reaching pretty far down the Nile. Trajan just took over Romania. They're also all the way up in Scotland fighting with the Celts. And Rome is having the time of its life in Persia. It's been a while since we've talked about Persia. Let's catch you up to speed on that. Rome and Persia went to war a lot. And while sometimes you had these really ambitious plans by Caesar and Mark Antony to go in and conquer Persia, a lot of the time these wars were just passing back and forth Armenia. Nero fought a war with Persia over Armenia. They kind of worked out a deal to share it, so Armenia was neutral for a while, but Trajan wanted to go big. He goes in, he takes over Armenia, and then he says screw it. He goes full Alexander the Great. He runs headlong into Persia, takes over their capital, makes it as far as the Persian Gulf before finally calling it a day. If Trajan wasn't in his 60s, he might have just taken over everything between Rome and India. But he was, in fact, in his 60s, and he died before he made it back to Italy. And things could have gotten really messy here, because despite being 63, Trajan hadn't really made it clear who his successor was going to be. But while Trajan was dying, his wife sprung into action to save the empire. She came out and showed everyone these super legit adoption papers that she had signed. Not Trajan, he didn't sign them, but she did. And this guy Hadrian was her son now, which means he's Trajan's son, which means he is in charge of the empire, please and thank you. And all he has to do to make it official is to pay the army and the Senate a bunch of money and kill a handful of people who might have been a problem for him. Hadrian, of course, most famous for building a massive f***-off wall across the border between England and Scotland. Blue-painted berserkers and naked wildlings can kindly stay on the other side of the wall, please and thank you. This was part of a larger policy of spending less time and money on expanding the empire's territory and settling for having nice, easy, defensible borders. So, bye-bye Roman Mesopotamia. Hadrian also spent a lot of his time traveling around the empire, listening to his subjects' needs and sometimes even addressing them. Except the Jews. He decided he was going to put a massive fuck-off shrine to Jupiter on top of the ruins of their most sacred temple. Good Emperor number 4, Antoninus Pius. He's actually most famous for what he didn't do, which is see a Roman army. Dude never went within 500 miles of a legion for his entire reign. Everything was just chill. He spent his tenure enjoying the finer things, like bridges, aqueducts, clean drinking water. He even sent some guys over to China just to see what was going on. Pax Romana, good time to be alive. Good Emperor number 5, Marcus Aurelius. Everybody likes this guy. Good emperor, but most famous because somebody stole his diary, published it, and now people have been studying it ever since because he's such a smart boy. Stoicism, full of facts and logic and knowledge. Mind over the body, reason over emotion, all that kind of stuff. And then, as if God stepped back into the room and realized Rome had it too good for too long, 5 to 10 million people die of plague. Then Marcus Aurelius dies and gets replaced by his son Commodus. Commodus has the distinction of being one of the worst, most hated Roman empires of all time. If you've seen the movie Gladiator, this is the emperor in that movie. Guy loved his gladiator fights. He basically rigged fights in the arena so that he could play and win them. He got into fights with professional gladiators who would die if they killed him, but live if they surrendered, so wow! Commodus won every fight! Roman historians talk about how Commodus put out an order to gather everyone in Rome with missing feet so that he could beat them to death with a club in the arena. He would fight wild animals by standing in the crowd and shooting arrows at the animals until he eventually hit enough to kill them. And every time he put on one of these gladiator shows, he charged the city of Rome for the privilege. Well, that's not technically true, because technically the city of Rome no longer existed. Commodus renamed the city after himself. He also renamed every month after himself. Commodus makes it an impressive 12 years before somebody remembered that killing the emperor is a thing people used to do back in the day, and so he done got strangled to death, and the Senate sentenced him to damnatio memoriae, where they were literally going to try and erase him from history. Just put him out of their minds, and now everyone can get on with their lives. Only remember how Nero's death caused the year of 4 emperors? Say hello to the year of 5 emperors. The assassins who kill Commodus pick one of his generals to be their new leader, and he, for all we know, could have been a great leader. But he didn't pay the royal guard, and the royal guard murdered him. The royal guard then realized they didn't actually care who the next emperor was, they just wanted to get paid. So they auctioned off the title of emperor. This is one of my favorite stories from Roman history. The empire gets literally sold to the highest bidder, an objectively amazing form of government, and the winner is this guy named Didius Julianus. Didius spends his life savings on becoming emperor, and immediately multiple rebellions break out. Didius realizes this might be bad, so after taking over the empire without bloodshed, he tries to give away the empire without bloodshed. He offers to share the empire, but the rebels don't care. The Senate sees which way the winds are blowing and declares Didius an enemy of the state who must be executed. Didius is thinking he didn't even do anything, and we know this because his last words are recorded as, "What evil have I done? Whom have I killed?" Oh, poor guy. Wow, the year of the 5 emperors played out a lot like the year of the 4 emperors, actually. Anyway, after poor Didius Julianus, it's just generals playing musical chairs with swords until one of them finally wins and starts a new dynasty, the Severans. Things in Rome are finally back on track for a good while with the Severans. You know, there's still no major crises. Rome is kicking Persia's butt and taking their land. The army gets bigger, everyone in the royal guard gets replaced. It was too good to last. The Severans got 25 years of 2 more really solid emperors in a row before the royal guard got stabby again. Then another general takes the throne. It doesn't turn into a whole thing this time. There's no year of the 6 emperors or anything. That would be ridiculous. But there are some ladies from the Severan dynasty who don't appreciate having their family ousted from power. One of the Severan ladies, a grandma no less, topples the emperor's army and puts her grandson on the throne. She gets power back in her family, and we get another just god-tier trash-fire emperor. Meet Elagabalus. Again, Roman historians love to smear people, so everybody get your grains of salt ready. We'll start with the grounded stuff and move up from there. Elagabalus is 14 years old when he becomes emperor. He worships a rock because he thinks it's a sun god. He actually names himself after that sun god, and he decides that anyone who wants to hold power in government had better get familiar with this sun god rock. Elagabalus could have been a drag queen, possibly transgender, but it's hard to say. It could have just been dude bro Roman historians taking pot shots at their least favorite emperor because the worst insult in Roman society was calling somebody a bottom, but there it is. Elagabalus married 4 women, seemingly at the same time. One of them was one of those Vestal Virgin pagan nuns who you are not supposed to mess with. Then there's the stories about Elagabalus putting tigers in his or her bathrooms to troll people who came over for dinner. Not even the weirdest way he or she killed dinner guests. Had another party where he or she dropped flower petals from the ceiling. There were so many petals that the guests were smothered to death. True or not, this emperor is an absolute icon. I personally own a coin minted by Elagabalus. Got his or her face on it. It is one of my most prized possessions. Grandma is not too pleased with these shenanigans. She put this kid on the throne and she can take this kid off the throne. She assassinates her own grandchild and then out of her back pocket she pulls out her emergency backup grandson. He is the new emperor. This one is named Alexander, and now Alexander knows what happens when you don't listen to Grandma. Alexander's rule was a lot calmer compared to death by rose petal, but even so, bad juju was brewing. Persia's got a new dynasty called the Sassanids, and they're an awful lot tougher than the old Persians. At the same time, Germanic tribes are invading modern-day France, and when Alexander goes to take charge of the situation, the legions decide they were going to fight the Germans, but now that Alex is here, they're gonna kill him instead. I guess his motivational speeches were just that bad. This is the line of demarcation for what's known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century, a time in the 200s AD when everything that could go wrong for Rome did. Plagues swept through the empire, killing millions of people faster than anyone can keep up with. That was a very important thing that was going on. I don't want to undersell it, but also, since everyone dies of plague isn't the most compelling narrative, let's talk about emperor murders. Roman emperor was one of history's deadliest career paths, especially in the 3rd century. And the turnover rate was gnarly, especially right after a major dynasty like the Severans. There was the year of 4 emperors after Nero ended his dynasty, and the reign of 5 emperors after Commodus ended his dynasty, so the guy that the army chooses to replace Alexander Severan has got his work cut out for him. But they choose a guy who is genre savvy. He knows he's in for some choppy waters. He consolidates power. He foils some plots. He takes his army into Germany. He wins a great victory. He does everything to make himself powerful and popular, and there's a rebellion anyway. Say hello to the year of 6 emperors. Mwah! Perfection. That's just Rome. That's what Rome does. It's actually amazing, the consistency between the Republic and the Empire. It's all generals fighting each other with the occasional dynasty in between. Okay, so the legions in Africa are rebelling. The guys leading this rebellion are Gordian I and Gordian II. They're both named Gordian. They both die immediately, 22 days. The shortest time anyone has been Roman emperor. Problem solved? Oh, oops, the Senate was supporting the Gordians, and now the genre-savvy emperor isn't happy. Well, the only way to fight an emperor is with an emperor. The Senate's solution? Elect not one, but two emperors, Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Real names, Balbinus and Pupienus, which honestly aren't better. The Tweedles are going to rule together, just like the two Roman consuls that led the Senate during the Republic days. Tweedles win! Job done! Except they are terrified of each other. They each spend their rule hiding in opposite corners of the palace, getting ready for the other one to try and assassinate them. Then, the royal guard really did come to assassinate them both, and they had to work together, but they were still more afraid of each other than the guys with spears about to murder them. And so they got murdered. This is where, if I had more time, I'd love to write a little song about all the ways the next emperors died, but here's the highlight reel. Killed by the Persian army, killed by Roman army, killed by the Goths, on his way to get stabbed by a rebel army, but then stabbed by his own army instead. The rebel then gets killed by another rebel. That guy goes retro, he goes back to being killed by the Persians. Assassination, plague, and then another usurper. What was that, 17 emperors in just over 30 years? Just to keep things interesting, a couple other generals also rebelled against the empire, but they decided that conquering the whole empire was too much work. So they each just took a piece of the empire instead. Egypt and the Levant are their own empire now, as are France and Britain. The trash fire was seriously in danger of burning itself out, but Emperor Aurelian said, "Not today!" Aurelian was more than a firefighter, he was a miracle worker. He rises to power from humble origins, he reunites the empire's lost territory, he builds new walls to protect the city of Rome, he reforms the currency, he strikes back at the Persians, but he never made it to Persia because nothing good can ever last. The royal guards kill him just 5 years after becoming emperor. Great story, Aurelian's reign, if you're interested. Next emperor lasts a year, the next guy 2 months, then 6 years. My guy Probus over here, ruling for an entire 6 years. That's practically forever. He's respecting the Senate and the Roman traditions. He's beating back the barbarians. He's launching a new campaign against Persia. Everybody likes him, but he gets assassinated anyway, because Rome is not allowed to have nice things. Then let's see, this guy lasts a year, that guy 2 years. Won't anyone restore Rome to its former glory? Or perhaps build a new Rome? Enter Diocletian. Diocletian starts as just another general scrambling for power, but when he takes over the empire, he decides to get clever with it. You see, he realized that France and the Middle East being independent wasn't all that bad. In fact, they were really useful in a way because they took a real load off of Rome having to fight Persia and the Germanic tribes, and if somebody could run those parts of the empire independently, but also take orders from the emperor in Rome, that would be amazing. So one day in 293 AD, Emperor Diocletian came up with a plan. He split the empire in half, and each half had a senior emperor and a junior emperor. And just to be cute, he called the senior emperor an Augustus and the junior emperor a Caesar. That way, both senior emperors can deal with their own problems, and when a senior emperor dies, the junior emperor already has enough power and support to become the new senior emperor without getting stabbed by rebels. And if the junior emperor tries to rebel against the senior emperor can call on the other senior emperor in the other half of the empire to come help him out. This new system worked so well that Diocletian and his co-emperor Maximian became the first emperors to ever retire. And there wouldn't be another succession crisis for 14 months. You see, while it looked great on paper, having 4 emperors was like having 4 cooks in the kitchen. It's messy, it's competitive, and somebody's gonna get stabbed. So initially, Diocletian and Maximian retire. and both of their junior emperors became the new senior emperors, Galerius in the east and Constantius in the west. And everything was hunky-dory, because if anybody started any funny business, there would be 2 junior emperors, 2 senior emperors, and 2 retired emperors all up in their business. The trouble began when Galerius and Constantius had to choose their junior emperors. Galerius in the east and Constantius in the west decided they were going to imitate the 5 good emperors and adopt a grown man to be their junior emperor. Constantius then dies, and the system works as planned. His junior emperor in the west, Severus, becomes the new senior emperor. Except Constantius also had a biological son, and that son caused problems. His biological son Constantine wants to be in charge, and he has an army that agrees with him. But never fear, Diocletian's system is here to save the day. If we can't agree on who the Western Roman Emperor is going to be, then the Eastern Roman Emperor gets to be the referee. That would be Galerius. He says that Constantius chose Severus as his heir, and so Severus is going to be the new senior emperor. But Constantine can be the new junior emperor. Except Diocletian's co-emperor Maximian, who by this point is retired, also had a biological son, who we will call Max Jr. Max Jr. just watched Constantine get rewarded with the position of junior emperor for pulling off his little power move, and so Max Jr. does the same thing. He goes to Rome and declares himself the emperor of the West. Galerius has no patience for this. He's the oldest, he's the eastest, he's the referee, and everyone else had better listen to him. He tells the Western Emperor, Severus, to go put this pipsqueak in the dirt, which is exactly the kind of thing that Diocletian's system was supposed to do. But the system was not designed to handle retired emperors. Max Jr. calls up his dad, saying that there's an army trying to kill him for no reason, and Maximian suddenly comes out of retirement, meaning there are now 4 people claiming to be the emperor in just the western half. When Severus, who is supposed to be in charge of the West, arrives in Rome to kill Max Jr., he finds Maximian at the door, and Severus's army decides that Maximian is the man and abandons Severus. Severus runs away and hides. Maximian knocks on the door. He says he totally understands how all of this happened. Maximian chose Constantius, and Constantius chose Severus, so Severus is kind of like his adoptive grandson. It's not Maximian versus Severus, it's Maximian and Severus against the problem. And if Severus comes outside, they can all settle this like Romans. Severus surrenders, Maximian arrests and executes him. Galerius is sick and tired of nobody listening to the referee. He tries to get rid of both Maximian and Max Jr., but when he sends his army out to fight them, the soldiers decide Maximian is the man, and now Maximian has an even bigger army. You would think that all of this would be bad news for Constantine. If Maximian becomes the senior emperor in the West and Max Jr. becomes the junior emperor in the West, then where does that leave Constantine? Apparently, it leaves Constantine as also a senior emperor? Kind of. Maximian is the senior emperor, but also his son Max Jr. is another senior emperor, but also Maximian went to Constantine and told him he was a senior emperor. Galerius is in the east tearing his hair out because none of these guys were supposed to be the emperor. They were supposed to listen to the referee. There was a flowchart, but no one followed it. So now there was going to be a civil war. Galerius tries to get Diocletian involved in all of this, but Diocletian spent the entire war growing cabbages in his garden. He was the first man to survive being a Roman emperor. He doesn't care what happened to his little system thing. Galerius decides to settle the matter once and for all and declares this random dude Licinius is going to be the senior emperor in the West, turning the stupidly complicated 3-way civil war into an even stupider 4-way civil war. If you're confused, you should be. Nothing means anything anymore. It's just a bunch of guys with different amounts of power. The first one to kick the bucket was Maximian. After going to all the effort of saving his son's life in 306 AD, he tries to depose his son in 308 AD. But the army, all of a sudden, decides that Max Jr. is the man, and they chase Maximian out of town. Maximian hides with Constantine until one day in 310 AD, Constantine is out running errands, and Maximian tells everyone Constantine is dead, and he's the new emperor in charge around here. Except Constantine isn't dead, and Maximian is no longer the man. So Maximian gets arrested and hangs himself in embarrassment. Second to kick the bucket was Galerius. He was lucky enough to die of natural causes, and when he died, he left the East to... checking notes... oh, he decided to flip everybody the bird. He split the Eastern Empire between Licinius, who was supposed to be in charge of the West, and this new guy whose name is Maximinus. Okay, no, we're not calling him that. His name is Maximinus Daza. We are calling him Daza. Constantine is fighting with Max Jr., and he's outnumbered, so he wants to make an alliance with Licinius, but Licinius is fighting with Daza, because of course he is. Even so, Constantine managed to carve a path all the way to the city of Rome. Max Jr. then has a choice to make. He can either hunker down behind the very defensible walls that Aurelian built around the city of Rome, or he can leave the city to fight Constantine in open combat. Okay, he does the second one. This was a big oopsie that led to Max Jr. losing, but he didn't regret it very long because he drowned trying to swim away across a river. Licinius won the war against Daza in the east, so we don't have to worry about him anymore. And then there were two, just Licinius and Constantine. They could have split the empire between them, but, well, is anyone surprised that didn't work out? They spent most of the next 12 years at war with each other, but Constantine won in the end. So Constantine did a lot of stuff as emperor. He moved his capital to the city of Byzantium, since the eastern half of the empire was a lot richer and more important than the western half, and the city's location made it good for conducting commerce and defending against invaders, both of which it would do a lot of for the next 1,000 years, which is why the Eastern Roman Empire is sometimes called the Byzantine Empire. But it's really still the Roman Empire. And yeah, that's pretty much it, aside from, Christianity. Okay, we're gonna be here a while. Before Constantine became emperor, he was getting ready for the battle against Max Jr. when he had a vision. It's the cross, or Jesus' initials, or something else Christian-y. That night, Jesus came to him in his dream. He congratulated Constantine on all the war he's doing, and he told Constantine that if he put Jesus' logo on his army's shields, or their flags, or something, then Jesus would go all Old Testament on Max Jr. A lot of people have tried to work out what Constantine saw, if there was some weird optical effects going on in the sky, or maybe his gradual conversion got condensed into a more compelling story. The whole stunt also could have been a practical consideration, since Christianity was a big and growing movement. In any case, this battle marked the tipping point where Constantine eventually converted to Christianity, and Christianity eventually took ultimate power in the empire. After Constantine becomes emperor, he realizes he has a problem, and it's Christianity. Constantine probably expected the Christians to be celebrating their cultural victory over the pagans, but as soon as the Romans stop crucifying them or feeding them to lions or whatever, the Christians in Egypt start ripping out each other's throats. The problem was that Jesus was too busy feeding the poor and healing the sick to leave behind a PowerPoint on his metaphysical essence. If only God can live without sin, are Jesus and God the same person? But then why did Jesus talk to God like he's a different person? Are there two gods? Did God create Jesus? These questions demanded answers, and if Constantine wanted a unified empire, he needed a unified church before the Christian factions all killed each other. Now, Constantine was not a theologian, and he knew if there were 10 different ways of interpreting Jesus and he tried to invent a new standard that could make everyone happy, there would be 11 different ways of interpreting Jesus. So his idea was to invite all of the priests to the city of Nicaea, let them hash it out among themselves, and if they couldn't decide on one headcanon for Jesus, then Constantine was going to pick one for them. The discussion ultimately boiled down to 2 competing ideologies, represented by 2 priests, Alexander and Arius. Arius argued that in order for God the Father to be a father, he had to be older than Jesus, because that's how dads work. Alexander argued that this was paradoxical nonsense, and that obviously Jesus was not made, but begotten. But even though Jesus was begotten, God never begot Jesus because Jesus was co-eternal with God, but also was his own person because he was 100% human and 100% God. And also the Holy Spirit was in there somewhere. Ultimately, Constantine and the priests decided that this second explanation made much more sense, and so they hammered out a document that would serve as the definition of mainstream Christianity for, to this day. As for Arius, he was banished for the crime of breaking the Jesus rules that hadn't existed yet. But although Arius was banished, his ideas would continue to cause all kinds of headaches in the future. And so would the Council of Nicaea, because this was the meeting that suggested that certain bishops were more important than others. Namely, the bishops of Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, and Rome. I'll give you a hint, one of these bishoprics took the idea and ran with it a lot further than the others. For now, at least, good lord, we can finally stop talking about Constantine. Constantine died in 337. He had 3 sons, and he named them Constans, Constantine, and Constantius, specifically because he hates you. He also split the empire into thirds, which sounds like it should have made everybody happy, but fun fact, no. They all start killing each other. Constantius is the big winner. He rules all the way until 361, and guess what? He believes in Arianism. He spent his reign trying to get the Arians and the Orthodox Christians to stop fighting each other long enough to fight the Persians. 2 lackluster results. But he did manage to pass a death penalty onto pagans. Man, that was fast. The rest of Constantius's family died in the Civil War, so after him, the empire went to the last person he wanted to inherit it, his cousin Julian. Julian's whole deal was that he was one of those types who believed if only our cultural traditions were exactly the same as 50 years ago, then all of our socioeconomic problems would be solved. And he was a pagan, but he was literally the only male relative Constantius had. Julian wanted everybody to be pagan again, and he started by passing a law of religious equality, which meant ending the death penalty for doing the wrong religion, and ending some of the favors given to Christians, but it also meant bringing back a lot of the Christian heretics that had been banished over the last few decades so that they could come in and cause mischief. If Julian had ruled for 30 years, it would be interesting to see how Christian and pagan doctrines all clashed and intermingled and coalesced. But he ruled for 3 years, so wah-wah. Shame too, he was a well-educated guy with a pretty good military track record, but here's the fun part. He died because he wasn't a good enough pagan. He's getting ready to go to war with Persia, and he consults the Sibylline Books of Prophecy, which are these sacred books that are supposed to be older than the Roman Republic, from all the way back when Rome was originally just a tiny little city-state ruled by kings. These books only came out when Rome was really in trouble. We're talking like plague, barbarians at the gates. Rome would go decades, sometimes centuries, without ever looking at these things. Well, Julian brought them out for his war against Persia, and the book said, "Under no circumstances should you leave your empire." Julian marched into Persia, made it all the way to the Persian capital, and then when his generals asked him what to do next, he quoted the immortal words of Sheldon J. Plankton. "I don't know. I didn't think I'd get this far." He wandered around the desert until he got stabbed in battle and died of infection. Julian's successor, also on campaign with him, spent his entire reign awkwardly marching back to Constantinople and then accidentally suffocated himself because the Byzantine Empire isn't allowed to have nice things. But he did have enough time to restore Christianity, and the death penalty for pagans didn't come back, so all in all, I'd call it a win. Things pretty much went back to normal. Barbarians are invading from all sides like normal, and each emperor is an open question of how much land are they gonna lose, like normal. The Goths just crossed the Danube River and started squatting in Roman territory. Emperor Theodosius can't do anything about them, but he can do something about his PR. He declares the Goths aren't invaders, they are Rome's independent allies who are going to fight for Rome and will always be on Rome's side because Rome is so generously allowing them to live in Roman territory, which is still Roman, even if the Goths are living there. There is then a civil war when an army guy names himself emperor, like normal. Theodosius puts him down, but you want to guess how long it takes until somebody else gives it a go? 4 years. 4 years between civil wars. It wasn't even because Theodosius was a bad emperor. Theodosius was one of the better emperors. One of the last great Romans, which is what they call everybody after Constantine who is even remotely competent. Maybe there weren't that many great Romans to begin with. But this second civil war is special. The Western Emperor has a huge falling out with one of his generals, and then the Western Emperor is found hanging in his room, and this general is real fast to say what a tragic suicide this is. You know, it's always the ones you least expect. Theodosius doesn't buy this for a second. He sends an army to give this guy a swift kick in the pants, and one of the guys he sends to do the kicking is a guy named Alaric. History buffs know where we're going with this one. There's a storm coming. See, Theodosius figured he could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. He put all of the Goths on the front lines of his army with a plan to win the war by taking overwhelming casualties. You know, the Stalin method. 10,000 Goths go through the meat grinder to win the war for Theodosius, and Alaric wonders if maybe this isn't the best career path for him. Alaric goes home to the Goths, and because he's a bit grumpy about watching all his friends die, he amasses a new army to show the Romans what that feels like. Alaric marches on Constantinople, causing varying degrees of mayhem and destruction along the way, depending on the source, and he demands more autonomy and protection for the Goths. The royal court in Constantinople is committed to, let's see here, doing nothing. Why? The situation was complicated. Theodosius was dead now, and his sons were now in charge, one in the east and one in the west. But the kids were still young, so it was really their advisors who were in charge, and they're fighting over this province called Illyrium that belongs to the east, but is kind of actually smack in the middle between east and west. The advisor who's pulling the strings in the west is a general named Stilicho. Stilicho wants to help the guy in the east fight Alaric, but while the guys in Constantinople are afraid of Alaric, who is running rampant through the Balkans, they are twice as afraid of Stilicho. They're afraid that if they let Stilicho come into the east, then Stilicho was going to defeat Alaric and then take away that middle province and also maybe attack Constantinople. The East orders Stilicho to stay at home because they've got this. Their best strategy to defeat Alaric was to hide in Constantinople and hope he goes away. Alaric can burn down every town in Greece, but sooner or later he's got to negotiate with the Eastern Emperor because he is never going to get inside of Constantinople. So, everybody just watches as poor Greece gets sacked and looted by Alaric's army until finally a change in administration, assassination, convinces the East that maybe they need some help. Stilicho comes in, he defeats Alaric, and predictably turns his victory into a power play. He sends a letter to Constantinople explaining that either they make Stilicho the new advisor to the emperor in the east, or Stilicho and Alaric are going to attack Constantinople together. The East says, bring it on. We can hide in Constantinople till the cows come home. Stilicho released Alaric, but he actually never followed through on attacking Constantinople. That's because the Western Roman Empire was an even bigger trash fire than the East, and so Stilicho had to postpone the attack to make sure Italy didn't starve to death. In the end, the East makes amends. They promise Alaric they'll stop using the Goths as human shields, and they make him one of their top generals. They pay the Goths not to attack them for a few years, and then they realize, wait a second, Alaric and all of the Goths live in that middle province. The middle province that the West and Stilicho have wanted for years. So they generously donate the problem to the West and make Alaric their problem. And it works like a charm. Within a couple of years, Alaric is invading Italy. Again, Stilicho beats him back, and again he refuses to get rid of Alaric because Stilicho wants to turn the Goths back around on the East somehow. Alaric is sitting in the middle of a cold war between East and West and making bank. This continues until everybody in Italy gets mad at Stilicho because if he hadn't been so hung up on taking over the East, then Alaric never would have been a problem for them in the first place. The West gets rid of Stilicho and declares Alaric an enemy of Rome, hoping that they've beaten him once or twice and now they can beat him once and for all. Only problem is they can't. Alaric lays siege to Rome and forces them to pay him even more money. After Alaric starts to leave, the Western Emperor sticks out his tongue and refuses to pay, and Alaric sacks the city of Rome. The Emperor wasn't even in Rome anymore, they'd moved the capital to Ravenna, but still, symbolically, this was real bad. Alaric continues his march into southern Italy, where he suddenly gets sick and dies. Happens to the best of us. Returning to the east, Theodosius' grandson, Theodosius II, is now in charge, or at least as in charge as a 10-year-old can be. And one of the first things his administration gets to work on is building some huge walls around Constantinople, because if Alaric has taught them anything, it's that hiding in Constantinople until the barbarians become somebody else's problem is a winning strategy. Attila the Hun showed up just a few decades later, and guess what? He bounced off of Constantinople's walls and then decided to be Italy's problem. If it's stupid but it works, it's not stupid. By some miracle, Theodosius II ruled for over 40 years without a single civil war, which is really too bad because it was the only space he was missing for Byzantine bingo. Barbarian raids? Check. Wars with the Persians that go nowhere? Check. Priests fighting over the minutiae of Christian metaphysics? Oh, you betcha. This time, the fight was over Mary, the Mother of God. You see, somebody made the mistake of saying that the Mother of God had given birth to God, and a bunch of people got mad because God was eternal and couldn't be birthed, even though they all agree he was physically born. One of the people this offended was named Nestorius. Nestorius was the Patriarch of Constantinople, which was sort of like a pope, except the empire had four: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria. The Patriarch of Rome was technically the most important, but every patriarch thought that he was the most important one. Nestorius tried to reach a compromise by saying Mary didn't give birth to God, she gave birth to Christ, and oops, he accidentally created a schism in the church. All of a sudden, the Patriarch of Alexandria comes out and asks Nestorius what he means by giving birth to Christ. Is he saying that Mary only gave birth to the body of Christ? Or does he think that there are two Christs, two gods, is that it? The Patriarch of Alexandria then gets the Patriarch of Rome on the phone, and pretty soon Emperor Theodosius has to make this a whole thing by convening the bishops from all across the empire just to put an end to this thing. The bishops get together, they decide Nestorius drew too much distinction between Jesus as man and Jesus as God, and therefore Nestorius is a heretic. End of story. But oops, now there's a priest in Constantinople who's drawing too little distinction between Jesus as man and Jesus as God, and someone's accused him of heresy. And this doesn't have to be a whole thing. The church does not have to make this into a whole thing. This was a low-level priest. The accusation was brought through the proper channels, and the priest's boss told him to get the hell out of the country for having the wrong opinion about Jesus in a very orderly fashion. The accused, however, had one last resort. The Christian church has 4 patriarchs. And if you ask your mom for something and she says no, what do? You go ask Dad. The Patriarch of Rome thinks this priest should be let off the hook, while the Patriarch of Alexandria decides he's actually in charge of everyone and overrules the Patriarch of Constantinople, which means now the patriarchs are fighting, Theodosius has to get involved, and this is now, officially, a whole thing. The council decides the priest shouldn't be exiled, and the Patriarch of Constantinople is physically beaten within an inch of his life for getting a case wrong, and everyone officially agrees that this whole Christology business is settled once and for all. Jesus was of two natures before being incarnated, at which point he became of one nature that is fully God and fully human and absolutely not a mixture of both. End of story. Okay, where were we? Theodosius. Despite having the opportunity to reign unopposed for his whole life, Theodosius decided to fall off a horse and die at age 49. One of his generals, oh, here we go again. One of his generals steps in. This guy is called Aspar, another Gothic general with an A in his name, bear with me. Aspar was a general who has been holding the Western Empire together with duct tape. Wherever there's usurpers, barbarians, Aspar is sent to deal with it. Theodosius dies, and Aspar becomes the most powerful man in the East. But aside from being part Goth, Aspar is also, I hope you were paying attention at the Council of Nicaea, an Arian, as in a follower of Arius. In other words, a heretic. Fat chance the people of Constantinople are going to allow a heretic to become their new emperor. So Aspar decides to be the kingmaker instead and puts one of his subordinates on the throne. That subordinate was named Marcian, and I only bring him up because remember the whole spat between all of those church patriarchs about whether to use the word God or Christ in the specific context of who was being birthed, and Theodosius had to bring in all the bishops to Constantinople to figure it out twice. Well, the Patriarch of Rome wasn't happy with the decision, so Marcian's gotta do it all over again. They said no, Jesus doesn't have one united nature. He has two natures within one person who is three beings who are one God. End of discussion. Oh, and just for kicks, they made the Bishop of Jerusalem a patriarch, so now there's 5 cooks in the kitchen. Emperor Marcian died after 7 years, and Aspar swapped him out with Leo I. Leo isn't cool with Aspar calling the shots, so he defeats Aspar with the help of his new best friend Zeno, who becomes emperor after Leo dies. Zeno is funny because he's from this place called Isauria, which has been part of the Roman Empire for centuries, but the people who live there are considered like these hick mountain folk. And so, at the time that the Western Roman Empire finally fell, the man in charge of the Eastern Roman Empire, tasked with keeping the dumpster fire alive and carrying out its destiny, was Zeno the Hillbilly. You see, there was a rebellion against Zeno, but it was over really quickly. All of Zeno's enemies fought each other until the Senate was so sick of them that they opened the city gates and let Zeno walk inside Constantinople. But in that time, Zeno was looking away from the West for 1 minute, and suddenly there's a barbarian in charge of Italy. But the barbarian is playing it cool. He sends Zeno a letter telling him not to even worry about it. The Senate is cool with it, and in fact, the Western Empire is going to be a client state of the Eastern Empire. That's right, it'll be just like the good old days. The East will have all the power. That's not exactly how it played out. The East and the West were in a cold war with each other just like they'd always been, but this does open us up to a fun conversation about the fall of Rome, because very little actually changed before and after this so-called fall. It's not like everybody just stopped being Roman as soon as a German took over. They'd already had emperors born in Gaul and Africa. The Senate was still around, and they were actually on board with their new king. Heck, he'd even been part of a Roman army. The word king had been a big no-no ever since the days of the Republic, but you know what else was a big no-no for hundreds of years? Christianity! But that king didn't last that long. Zeno asks another barbarian named Theodoric to pretty please attack the West instead of the East, and he just goes and does it. And the way he does it is really funny. He attacks the West, and the barbarian king of the West tells him he can't come in, and then Theodoric asks, well, What if we were co-kings who ruled together as friends? And the king says, okay, and lets Theodoric come into the city. And then they throw a feast to celebrate their friendship, and Theodoric kills him. Just red weddings him immediately. Theodoric went on to have a pretty good run with Italy. He was making marriage alliances with the Franks in France and had direct control over land from the west coast of Spain all the way into the Balkans. Meanwhile, what was Emperor Zeno the Hillbilly up to? If you guessed more Christological debates, you get a cookie. When we last left our intrepid church, they had decreed that Jesus was simultaneously fully human and fully God, but those are two separate things at the same time which never mixed and never contradicted each other. Two natures, not one. A lot of people were pretty sure he had one, though. Like the Patriarch of Alexandria, for example. And Zeno needed to do something about that, so he put on his religion hat and got to work. This time, instead of calling all the bishops, Zeno just started writing a decree. Which honestly, good for him. And he said definitively, end of story, Jesus definitely is... Absolutely nobody was happy with this decision. The patriarchs start fighting again, the church falls apart into a schism, and then Zeno dies. He didn't have any sons, so his wife chose his successor. She picked a senior citizen civil servant, the kind of guy who wouldn't upset anyone. Except, of course, for Zeno's brother, who was very angry about not being picked, resulting in the 4th civil war in 2 decades. It's just... this isn't even a particularly bad civil war. Zeno's brother lost and the appointed civil servant guy won. It just amazes me how contentious the Romans were about their emperors. It wasn't even just the generals or the provinces. The sports teams in Constantinople were part of this civil war, because the sports teams in Constantinople were also street gangs / political parties. How? Zeno's successor isn't particularly interesting. There's only one fun story about him, and it probably isn't true. The story goes that he had 3 nephews, but he didn't know which one he wanted to give the empire to. So he decides to do it by lottery. He invites them all to come talk to him in a room with 3 couches, and underneath one of the couches is a note saying, "Congratulations, you are the new emperor." Except 2 of the kids decide to buddy up on one couch, and so the one couch with the winning lotto ticket for the empire is the one couch that nobody sits on. I like to imagine he must have tried several of these schemes and just none of them worked. So one day he's talking to God because nothing is working, and he makes up his mind that the next person to walk through that door is going to be the emperor. Maybe he invited all of his family to come see him again or something. But instead, the captain of the guard happens to stroll in, and the emperor says, "Good enough," and gives this guy the empire. His name was Justin. Surprisingly modern after all of these other names I've been making you remember. And he was originally a peasant, possibly a swineherd. But he packed up his things and moved to Constantinople for greater opportunities, and he fought against the Persians in one of those civil wars, and eventually he becomes captain of the palace guard. And he's one of the guys who's at the emperor's deathbed, and everyone's wondering who the next emperor is going to be. There are the aforementioned nephews, but everyone's pretty sure it's going to be the Grand Chamberlain Amantius. Or more precisely, Amantius is gonna put one of his lackeys on the throne, just like Aspar did. Amantius controls a large army, and he's got lots of money, and he's going around the palace bribing everyone, because officially, the way that the emperor is going to get chosen is by a vote. Justin takes the bribe from Amantius and then turns right around and uses that money to fund his own campaign for emperor. Justin makes a bunch of bribes. He also controls the palace guard, who are smaller than Amantius's army, but better trained, and importantly, they are actually inside of Constantinople. And so when the vote is cast, Justin comes out on top, and he assassinates Amantius the next week. Things under Justin were pretty chill. There were, as usual, tensions with the Persians, but those didn't flare up too badly. Theodoric over in Italy was pretty cool to just use Constantinople's seal of approval as a way to stay popular with the common folk in Italy. As Justin got older, more and more of his policy was influenced by his darling nephew Justinian. Justinian is a big one. Real S-tier Byzantine emperor. I would say probably number 2 in terms of fame, just behind Constantine and just above Basil II, who we'll get to in another 500 years. If you've ever seen the Hagia Sophia, the incredibly famous church turned mosque turned museum turned mosque again, that's Justinian's doing. Justinian comes to power as emperor in 527 AD. He had his moments dealing with religious shenanigans. He put his foot down in support of orthodoxy once and for all. We all agreed on 2 natures, so 2 natures it shall be. He also gathered up all the laws and decrees passed in the last 400 years by God knows how many different emperors and established an official canon of Roman law, which is a huge accomplishment that gives us all kinds of insights into the customs and priorities of the Roman Empire in late antiquity. Not to mention it formed an important foundation for law in the entire Western world, but oh dude, we do not have time to get into the weeds. Legal history is fascinating, but I am just not ready to bring you there right now. Let's talk about the 2 things that Justinian is known for. Number 1, the Nika riots. You'll remember from earlier, chariot races were no joke. There's that famous quote that you can keep the common people happy with just 2 things, bread and circuses. That wasn't a reference to clowns and tightropes, that was a reference to the circus, i.e. the name of the chariot racing track. People would buy idols of their favorite charioteers and cast curses onto the rival team. And hey, coincidentally, the racing track holds 100,000 people and is also right next to the royal palace, and so, if the common people of Constantinople wanted to be heard by the emperor, a great way to do that was to get tens of thousands of people to chant at him in between races. And the easiest way to organize sports fans was into teams. So at this point in history, which team you rooted for in the chariot races also determined things like what political issues you stood for, what gang you were a part of, your opinions on the metaphysical nature of Jesus, and each team had their own gang of aristocrats bankrolling them. In 532 AD, Emperor Justinian was just winding down a war with Persia, and was in the middle of negotiating a treaty of eternal peace. And it was really important to him that Constantinople not be on fire while he was negotiating. So he announced there was going to be a chariot race to keep the people happy. Unfortunately, after one of the last chariot races, when the blue team and the green team had been murdering each other, Justinian had locked up members of both teams. Suddenly, both teams had one thing they could agree on. They wanted their guy released from prison. Justinian refused, and now the 2 biggest teams in the city, who have lots of money and a propensity for violence, are both chanting Nika, which means something like victory or conquer. In other words, conquer the emperor. Both teams broke out of the stadium, assaulted the palace, and burned the city of Constantinople to the ground. And because these teams were bankrolled by powerful aristocrats, many of whom were unhappy with Justinian for how he was picking his advisors, suddenly, these out-of-control sports fans started to have very specific opinions about the emperor's legal counselors. At a certain point, the crowd began to support a new emperor, a man named Hypatius. Hypatius was, by all accounts, a poor, unfortunate soul. Do you remember the story about the 3 nephews who could have become emperor if they had sat on the right couch? Hypatius was one of those nephews, and he was okay with not being emperor. He'd been treated well, he was fine. So when the mob starts calling for a new emperor, before they settle on a name, Hypatius ran inside the palace with Justinian to prove he's on Justinian's side. But since everything is on fire and Justinian doesn't know who he can trust, he sends Hypatius back out of the palace, to the mob, even though Hypatius begs to stay. Hypatius then goes home and locks himself inside his house waiting for the whole thing to blow over. But the mob found him and dragged him out of his house, insisting that he was the new emperor. Meanwhile, back inside the palace, Justinian is getting ready to run away, when suddenly his wife Theodora grabs him by the ear. Before she was an empress, Theodora used to be an actress, which at the time was understood to heavily imply sex worker. She tells Justinian that she would rather die than go back to being a commoner, with this very poetic monologue about how the emperor's royal purple robes make for the finest funeral shroud. So Justinian stays, and he hatches a plan with his generals. He sends the first general into the circus with a bag of money. The first general goes up to the Blues and reminds them that Emperor Justinian is a blue fan, and the would-be Emperor Hypatius is a green fan. And wouldn't they rather take this money and go home instead of supporting a filthy green? So some of the Blues take the money and go home, triggering Phase 2. The second and third generals then enter the circus and kill 30,000 unarmed civilians. How this didn't explode into an even bigger revolt is entirely beyond my understanding. And Hypatius, poor Hypatius, the involuntary usurper, was put to death. The second thing Justinian is known for is conquering half of the Mediterranean. This begins in North Africa, the year after the Nika riots, specifically the area around Carthage, or modern-day Tunisia. Justinian had been allied to the king of the Vandals in North Africa, who was then dethroned by his cousin, who was not so friendly. Justinian needed a capable hand to lead this expedition, so he handed it over to his general Belisarius. Belisarius was sort of a risky pick. The last time he'd been left in charge of anything was in Persia, and it went very poorly. Belisarius had been recalled back to Constantinople, but in a twist of fate, that led to him becoming one of the men who put down the Nika riots. So, Justinian gave him a second chance in North Africa. And Belisarius conquers it in less than a year. Belisarius had definitely proven himself capable, but Justinian needed someone who was more than just capable. He needed a man who was capable enough to conquer the province and trustworthy enough not to run away with Africa and turn it into his own kingdom. So he gave Belisarius a choice between becoming the governor of Africa or returning to Constantinople to parade through the city in a traditional Roman triumph. And, no doubt to the emperor's relief, Belisarius chose the parade. Just in time, too, because there was another usurper situation going on in Italy that very same year. Belisarius lands in Italy and has another smashing campaign. He almost failed at the siege of Naples, but one of his soldiers discovered an unsecured aqueduct that allowed his entire army to walk right in. Isn't that crazy? Imagine such a powerful city falling because of a single unguarded entrance. Pathetic, frankly. Imagine if something like that happened in Constantinople. Next, he made it to the city of Rome, which was so far gone from its glory days that from a tactical or economic standpoint, it was hardly worth mentioning. It was a huge win from a PR standpoint, though. Justinian got to celebrate Rome being back in the hands of the Romans, which again makes it really ambiguous when Rome actually fell. I've heard it argued that it was actually Justinian's reconquest of Italy that set the stage for the fall of Rome, because even though the Ostrogoths had been in charge of Italy for a while, the people still thought of themselves as Roman. But then, all of a sudden, they're being invaded by another group of people who are calling themselves Roman, which started to make the people in Italy feel less Roman. And then, when the Byzantines lose control of Italy again later on, that presents a much clearer divide of Italy going from Roman to non-Roman. The campaign ended at the Goths' capital of Ravenna, where Belisarius lays another siege. Justinian sends a messenger to Italy explaining he's ready to call it a day. Justinian will take half of Italy and leave the other half to the Goths. And Belisarius pulls off the riskiest maneuver I have ever seen. Belisarius disobeys direct orders from the emperor and continues the siege. The Goths, who thought that the war was finally over, are really not happy about this, and so they send their own messenger to Belisarius. They tell Belisarius that what they'll do is give over all of Italy to Belisarius and make him the Western Roman emperor. And Belisarius says yes. He walks into the city with his army and then conquers the city in the name of Justinian. If this had not gone perfectly, if Belisarius hadn't managed to pull all of this off before Justinian found out, he would have been a dead man. He could have just gone home. He ends up having to fight the Persians because the Treaty of Eternal Peace lasted for less than 8 years, and then back to Italy for a few more years, but by the end of Justinian's rule, the Eastern Roman Empire has control over all of the East, plus Italy, plus North Africa, plus the Dalmatian coast, plus parts of Spain. All of this while the empire was hit with a volcanic winter and one of Europe's worst ever plagues. Reviews are mixed on whether or not this was actually a good idea. On the one hand, it was hype. On the other hand, the kingdom's coffers were now empty, and controlling Italy was perhaps more of a burden than an asset. When Justinian died, the new emperor discovered he was broke and found one place where he could save money. He stopped paying his neighbors to not attack the empire, and then his neighbors attacked the empire. These folks called the Lombards swept into Italy. The Byzantines had left an army to defend Italy, and it crumpled immediately. 3 years after Justinian died. 3 years! And half of Italy was under Lombard control. It wasn't even just like the northern half either. The Lombards took over huge swaths of the countryside, leaving the Byzantines with just the area around Rome and Ravenna, with the tiniest little corridor between them and a little bit of land at the very southern end of the peninsula. It wasn't pretty. And then the Persians attacked, because of course they did. They fight over Armenia for the 10,000th time. The outcome doesn't really matter, because they'll just go to war again in another 10 years. And Justinian's heir has a mental breakdown and dies. But things weren't all bad. In 582, we get an emperor named Maurice. Maurice, in my opinion, is sort of an underrated emperor, and proof that the long, slow fall of the Roman Empire was not for want of talented leaders. Maurice was a secretary who became commander of the Imperial Guard, who was then suddenly promoted to commander-in-chief of the Byzantine army with no military experience in the middle of an ongoing war with Persia. Maurice steps up to the challenge inexplicably well, and is on the short list of men chosen to become the next emperor. The current emperor, Tiberius II, was dying, and he didn't know whether to give the empire to Maurice or this other guy, Germanus. And instead of making up his mind, he gave one of his daughters to each of the two men to marry, and named them both his successor, because he was going to split the empire again. Thank God that didn't happen. Germanus turned down the offer to be made emperor, and the only explanation given is that he was just a super humble guy. Shout out Germanus for keeping the empire together. You are seen and appreciated. Maurice becomes the emperor without any bloodshed, and he inherits the war with Persia. The war is long and messy, but towards the end, Maurice gets a very unique opportunity. The Persian king shows up at Maurice's doorstep. Not with an army, I mean just him. It turns out he had been overthrown, and now he wants Maurice to take him in and let bygones be bygones. The Senate thinks this is a terrible idea, but Maurice says, sure, come on in. Better still, Maurice adopts the Persian king and changes the whole war. Now, instead of whatever they were fighting about before, Maurice has just made this war a personal matter of fighting to reclaim his son's rightful place on the throne of Persia. And all of the Persians who support Maurice's son come out of the woodwork to help. The war is won by Persians and Byzantines fighting together, and Maurice's son is so thankful to his dad that he gives the Byzantine Empire a whole bunch of land, and they sign a treaty of perpetual peace. And not just that, the Byzantine Empire had been paying the Persians for peace, and now all of that money was theirs to keep. The empire's fortunes had finally turned. Justinian bet the empire's treasury on reconquering the West, and Maurice gambled on this power play in Persia. But now, the coffers were filling back up, and the army was free to ignore Persia and focus on more important things. Maurice reorganized the administration of Italy to stand up to the Lombards, and for the first time in a long time, instead of barbarians raiding the Balkans, now it was Maurice raiding the barbarians. And then one of Maurice's generals revolted and cut his head off. This is why the Byzantine Empire can't have nice things. And the second Maurice's head hits the floor, guess what? The Persians are invading, and the Slavs are raiding the Balkans. There's no more money to defend Italy. The entire upper caste of the empire is in upheaval, and everything's on fire, which is, of course, the empire's natural state. The Byzantines and the Persians fight for 25 years. The Persians destroy the Byzantines, but can't crack the walls of Constantinople. And then the Byzantines destroy the Persians. And the end result of the costliest war in anyone's living memory is, once again, everything is exactly the same as it was when they started. The only difference is that now both empires are absolutely crippled. But hey, you know whose empire isn't crippled? Muhammad. Muhammad comes out of his cave in 610 AD with revelations from the Archangel Gabriel, and by the time of his death in 632, he has conquered pretty much all of Arabia. The Byzantines and the Persians finished their 25-year slugfest in 628, so they are very much not ready for what's coming. After Muhammad's death, there was a brief crisis within the Muslim Caliphate as its leaders struggled to face two major problems. One, Muhammad was the magic glue holding everything together, one religious, political, and military leader that everyone got behind. After his death, while many had zealously adopted their new faith, some others were beginning to have second thoughts. And politically, Arabia didn't suddenly become a single state. It was still made up of a lot of different tribes, and some of those tribes were loyal to the person of Muhammad, but not to any kind of office or state. And once Muhammad died, the party was over. Problem number two, the Byzantine and Persian empires were less than receptive to a new superpower on their doorstep. A great solution, then, would be to unite the caliphate through a common enemy. If the caliphate could take over some new lands in the Middle East, which at that point in time was quite wealthy, everybody would get lots of money and feel good about spreading the word of God. It's hard to say if the new caliph was explicitly thinking along those very sort of Machiavellian political lines, but it's interesting that there is very little mention of an immediate trigger for why the caliphate decided to invade the Byzantine and Persian empires. Once they did invade, things did not go well for the Byzantines. In the 1500 years covered in this video, there are two battles after the time of Augustus, whose names I can remember. Both of them are disasters for the Byzantines, and this is one of them. The Battle of Yarmouk. The Byzantine Empire suffered tenfold as many casualties as the Caliphate, and quickly lost pretty much all of the Middle East. Goodbye Syria, goodbye Judea, goodbye Egypt, goodbye Antioch, goodbye Jerusalem, and goodbye Alexandria. Silver lining number one, if Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria are gone, then the emperor only has to worry about the patriarchs of Rome and Constantinople fighting with each other. Silver lining number two, things could have been much worse. The Persian Empire fell into a huge civil war after they finished fighting the Byzantines, and when they got jump scared by the Caliphate, they just 100% collapsed. Poof, nothing left. So what is the Byzantines' response to a threat the likes of which they have probably not seen since Carthage? Well, as soon as the emperor died in 641, his wife was supposed to rule as a regent, but one of his generals seized power and installed a child on the throne, which at this point I suppose goes without saying. It ends up working out though, since the general didn't last long and the child emperor got to have a nice long reign. There were some early attempts to wrestle back control of the Middle East. In 645, the emperor sends Admiral Manuel to reclaim Alexandria. The people of Alexandria hailed him as a liberator, just like Belisarius, and then he spent his time plundering his own people's countryside until the Arabs kicked him out. Then, in 647, Carthage declares independence from the Byzantines because of, guess what? Disagreements about the metaphysical nature of Jesus. To be fair, the Caliphate's armies were expanding westward, and Carthage had zero confidence in the Byzantines' ability to protect them. Sadly, their ability to protect themselves was not much better. The Caliphate next attacked parts of eastern Turkey and some islands off the coast of Greece, and only a civil war within the Caliphate prevented them from attacking Constantinople itself. With a brief window of respite, the emperor knew what he had to do. He had to argue about the metaphysical nature of Jesus. In 649, the Patriarch of Rome calls for his own council, without the emperor, which feels like a good enough point to stop calling him the Patriarch of Rome and start calling him the Pope. I hope you see my point that the Pope was originally sort of a first among equals, but over time, the popes just started giving themselves all kinds of new powers. In this instance, the Pope didn't like how the emperor was doing things, so he called his own council, and his own council declared that the emperor was wrong, and so the emperor arrested the Pope. The emperor also started to get worried about his brothers plotting against him, so he gets his brother killed. Whoops, that brother is popular, so Emperor Constans decides it's time for some fresh air, far, far away from Constantinople. He leaves Constantinople, goes on campaign in Macedonia to fight the Slavs, wins, keeps going to southern Italy to fight the Lombards, loses, but he got to vacation in Rome for a couple of weeks, which was pretty cool. He visited the Pantheon and he liked its bronze decorations so much that he tore them off and took them home with him, which I guess falls under his authority as emperor, but I think that is just a hilarious image. The emperor so broke he goes to tour one of his own cities and robs the place. Can't have shit in the Dark Ages. Emperor Constans returns to Constantinople eventually, hoping that the whole thing about everyone being mad at him has blown over, and he gets assassinated with a bucket. Maybe. Story goes, one of his bath attendants filled a bucket with soap and herbs and then placed it over the emperor's head, temporarily blinding him, and then he hit the emperor in the head with the bucket and cracked his skull open. I'm really not sure why he didn't just lead with that. The new emperor, Constantine IV, takes over, and bad news, while the Byzantines were busy fighting over Jesus and robbing themselves, the Caliphate finished its civil war. They've got a new dynasty in charge called the Umayyads, and they are ready to do to the Byzantines what they did to the Persians. Take everything, take all their land and money, basically. I guess it sounded more dramatic the other way. In 674, the Arab army makes it all the way to Constantinople. Luckily, the emperor saw that one coming from a mile away. There's not a lot of things the Byzantines can do right, but defending Constantinople is one of them. And this is the part where they use Greek fire. It's like, what did they call it in Game of Thrones? Wildfire? It's like napalm. They would shoot it through tubes in their boats like a flamethrower, or use it in Greek fire grenades, and hopefully it would land on the enemy's boats and catch them on fire, but the stuff could literally burn on water, and no one knows exactly what was in it because the Byzantines kept the production process a secret for all that time. Really cool stuff. Gotta love medieval settings where flamethrowers and napalm grenades are historically accurate. It's also kind of crazy that this stuff was supposed to have been invented by one dude just 2 years before the siege happened. Talk about good timing. The Umayyad Caliphate lays siege for almost 5 years, according to the traditional Byzantine account, though that's a little disputed. And once it's over, the fear that this upstart Arab army was going to completely conquer the Byzantine Empire finally abated. And now that that was over, the emperor could go back to doing more important things, like more arguments over Jesus Christ! They reaffirmed a bunch of stuff they already said 200 years ago, and the people who disagreed with them were in the parts of the empire that got taken over by the Caliphate, so look who's laughing now. Other than that, the Byzantines had a pretty good 50 years ahead of them. The Lombards in Italy were capturing their cities, and so were the Bulgars in the Balkans. But other than that, a pretty good 50 years. This is also where we get the theme system. This is one of those things that if you're just here for fun stories from history, you can tune out for a second. But if for God knows what reason you are using this video to study, it's gonna be on the test. It's just one of those things that everybody has to talk about when they bring up the Byzantines. People disagree about who and when, but somebody divided the empire into a new kind of province called a theme. And the big difference was that every theme was ruled by a strategos, or strategy boy, who pulled double duty as a civilian governor and as a military leader. Way back when the biggest threat to Rome was civil wars between powerful generals, Diocletian had separated governing and militarying, but now that there were Lombards and Bulgars and Arabs, oh my, the governors got to have their toys back. Alright, let's keep this train moving. Constantine IV dies in 685, and because times are so good, we get to have another Justinian. Justinian II. Because only good things happen when there's a Justinian on the throne. Credit where it's due, this Justinian was doing a fine job of reconquering some territory. Nothing major, but any decade where the empire isn't actively shrinking is pretty good for the Byzantines. He does have this great idea where he thinks to himself that these Slavs that are invading the empire wouldn't be such a problem if he just moved them somewhere else. So when he reconquers parts of the Balkans, he moves at least 30,000 Slavs into Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. And so the next time the Umayyad Caliphate attacks Anatolia, before they can get to the Byzantines, they have to go through the Slavs. Killing two birds with one stone right there. or the Umayyads can just pay all the Slavs to turn around and join them in attacking the Byzantines, because the Slavs are now angry at the Byzantines for having just done a Trail of Tears. Genius! Justinian was very unpopular, mostly for other reasons. He had a lot of opinions about a lot of things and did not get along with anyone who disagreed with him. And eventually, the people of southern Greece get to thinking, you know who would be a better emperor than this guy? Our local governor, who also, because of the theme system, has his own army. Wow, that did not take long. The Greeks overthrow Justinian, but they don't kill him. By this point in time, the Byzantines have this tradition where they don't kill their political enemies, they just cut off part of their face. Constantine IV had two brothers. He cut off both of their noses so that no one would ever think about making them emperor. Likewise, Justinian II gets his nose lopped off because everyone knows you can't have an emperor without a nose. Justinian, now in exile, is on a mission to change that. He does what any good Roman would do and colludes with the empire's enemies to regain power. He promises his daughter to the Bulgarian Khan, then rides up to the gates of Constantinople and asks them to open the gates for his army of Bulgars because he stands zero chance of actually conquering the city in battle because of the whole wall situation, which makes the whole Bulgarian army thing seem kind of pointless in retrospect. However, he snuck in through an empty aqueduct and did a coup d'etat that way instead, and he makes sure that the people who overthrew him lose their whole heads. And Justinian starts wearing a golden nose, so haha, loophole! He then immediately breaks all of his promises to the Bulgars and declares war on them, which he loses. He then fights a war with the Arabs, which he loses, so he launches an invasion of Italy that he was sure to win, because he wasn't attacking the Lombards, he was attacking his own empire, for doing religion wrong, obviously. In a surprise to no one, there was another uprising, which Justinian lost, costing him the empire and his life. You know what that means? New dynasty! Emperor Philippicus took the throne in 711 and got overthrown less than 2 years later. Not killed, and not denosed either. The whole denosing thing obviously didn't work, so we're doing eye gouging now, because everyone knows you can't have an emperor without eyes. So hey, new dynasty! Emperor Anastasius II comes to town and is ready to stabilize the empire. He was overthrown and sent to a monastery less than 2 years later. Third time's the charm. Meet Emperor Theodosius III. He was a tax collector, and now he's the emperor now. He was overthrown and sent to a monastery less than 2 years later. This was a really chill 50 years for the Byzantines, I swear. This is just what they do for fun when the caliphate isn't threatening their existence. The theme system is working as intended. New dynasty. Leo the Isaurian becomes emperor, and 4 months later, no. He's not ousted in a revolt. Constantinople is just being attacked by the caliphate. Everything is fine. They've got walls, and they've got Greek fire, and the caliphate retreats after only a year, and Leo the Isaurian is still in charge. Then the rebellions happened. Sicily rebelled almost accidentally because they heard Constantinople had been conquered by the Umayyad Caliphate, so they started supporting a new emperor. Leo puts down that rebellion, and then surprise! Remember 2 minutes ago, Justinian II went to the Bulgars and made a deal with them so they would help him attack Constantinople? And remember how they were completely useless in breaching the walls, and then Justinian completely betrayed them? And do you remember 1.5 minutes ago when Anastasius II got sent to a monastery? Anastasius II got out of that monastery. He made basically the same deal with the Bulgars, quite possibly shakes hands on it with the same exact Bulgarian Khan. They attack Constantinople and they can't get through the walls. So yeah, he loses, and Leo is still emperor. I just thought that was a very remarkable case of short-term memory loss for everyone involved in that fiasco. Leo the Isaurian ends up ruling for a good 24 years, in fact. He beats the Umayyad Caliphate in some pretty major battles. He sets up some new law codes. It looks like he got rid of the death penalty in a lot of cases. The Byzantines are weirdly progressive when it comes to that. He also just couldn't help himself but to get the Byzantines started on another never-ending religious debate. You see, after 400 years, everybody finally agreed on the metaphysical nature of Jesus. But the question remains, how do we feel about pictures of Jesus? Leo was not a fan. He thought that sounded a lot like idolatry. That ended up getting him in hot water over in Italy because the Pope did not agree, and what little remained of Byzantine territory in Italy just kind of... I don't know if it's accurate to say they became independent, but pretty much they stopped listening to the emperor and the emperor stopped listening to them. By sheer coincidence, in the 750s, the Lombards finally took over the Byzantine territory that included the city of Rome, which, if you want to, is yet another date when you could say Rome finally fell. Honestly, it is a miracle the Byzantines held on to Rome for that long. Goodness me. And it would seem that the new emperor, Leo's son Constantine V, felt similarly. When northern Italy got taken over, the Pope was very scared and asked Constantine V for help, but Constantine explained that he was really busy fighting the Umayyads, Italy was really far away, and to be honest, he didn't like the Pope that much anyway because of the whole fight over whether or not Christians were allowed to have pictures of Jesus. Best he could do was to give the Pope one piece of advice. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Get some other barbarian kingdom to fight the Lombards, and everything will be honky-dory. So the Pope went to Paris and asked the Franks for a favor. The Franks come in and take back parts of central Italy and give it to the Pope to rule as his own personal kingdom, which is where we get the Papal States, which eventually turned into the Vatican. That's why the Vatican is its own country to this very day. And things get messier, but we've got to pop back over to Constantinople for a second. Like I said, Constantine V was very much a no-go on pictures of Jesus. He went around sacking monasteries just to get rid of him. This would later earn him the very amusing title Constantine the Dung-Named, or Constantine Anointed with Urine, because later Byzantine emperors very much did not care for him. Constantine the Doo-Doo Head, basically. But aside from believing that pictures of Jesus were the work of the devil, Constantine the Doo-Doo Head wasn't so bad. He was basically Leo the Isaurian Part 2. More legal reforms, more small territorial victories, nothing very interesting. His daughter-in-law, on the other hand, that's where things get fun and dramatic again. Constantine the Doo-Doo Head dies. His son is the new emperor. That son invades the Abbasid Caliphate, throws a triumph, whoops, somebody called John Green, he died of tuberculosis. His son is only 9 years old, which means there's gonna be shenanigans. The person in charge is the boy's mother, Irene of Athens, and she has a huge to-do list. Top of the list is just battling away all of the distant relatives and generals and courtiers who want to make themselves emperor. Second on the list was letting Christians have pictures of Jesus again, which involved some real 5D chess on Irene's part. The whole thing against pictures of Jesus was started by one of those big councils of all the bishops and whatever, so the only way to undo it was to do another council. But a lot of the bishops had gotten their jobs specifically because they didn't like pictures of Jesus. And actually, the first time Irene tries to make this whole council thing happen, it turns into a January 6th situation where a bunch of dudes, from the Imperial Guard actually, interrupt the proceedings and threaten to kill some of the delegates. So Irene invents this whole story about the Arabs invading the East and only her most troublesome soldiers can stop it. Except there was no invasion. She just got those soldiers far, far away from the capital so that they couldn't stop her, and so she could arrest them. The Pope was pretty happy to hear that Jesus selfies were kosher again, but the guy Irene really wanted to impress was Charlemagne. The 780s were such a cool decade because there were three really iconic monarchs in charge at the same time. In France and Germany, you've got Charlemagne, who's like the European king. In the Eastern Roman Empire, you've got Irene, and in the Middle East, you've got Harun al-Rashid, who I would get way too distracted talking about, but like his rule, peak Islamic golden age. Al-Rashid's empire was probably the most powerful of the three, with Charlemagne after him and then Irene after him, but Irene had plans to change that. She was going to get her son married to Charlemagne's daughter, but sadly, she and Charlemagne ended up going to war, and that called the whole thing off. They didn't talk to each other for another decade. And by the time Irene and Charlemagne were talking again, Irene did not have a son anymore. Irene's son, Constantine VI, didn't stay 9 years old forever, and at a certain point, he was a teenager and he thought he knew better than his mother. He starts scheming, but he's bad at scheming. Irene catches him, spanks him, and sends him to his room for several days. And when Irene sends him to his room, the army kind of freaks out. Irene's reign hadn't been the most successful militarily, and the army was sort of hoping that Constantine VI would at least be as good of a general as Constantine the Doo-Doo Head. And he has to be a better general than Irene because he's a man, right? So they decide his time out is a good time to rise up and put Constantine VI on the throne and lock Irene away in the palace. Except Constantine VI is not a great general. He is in fact as bad at generaling as he is at scheming. And 2 years later, he tells his mom she can be his co-ruler if she fixes his problems for him. And Irene from this point looks like she's out for revenge. She's stoking Constantine's paranoia, kind of setting him up for failure. His popularity plummets, and eventually he's ousted in favor of his mother. And just to be safe, Irene scoops out his eyeballs, possibly causing his death. She may not have been as great a leader as Charlemagne or Harun al-Rashid, but boy, she did find a way to be just as memorable. Cut back to Italy real quick. The Pope is fighting over whether or not he should be allowed to be the Pope. A bunch of people don't like this guy, and they chase him out of Rome. He runs all the way to Charlemagne. Charlemagne does him a big favor by getting him back in power in Rome. He basically puts his hand on the Pope's shoulder and tells everybody that the Pope is under his protection. So the Pope does Charlemagne a favor of his own. The Pope says that because Charlemagne is big and awesome and Christian and has an empire, and since there isn't a man on the throne in Constantinople, that the position of Roman Emperor is currently vacant, which means that the Pope, as the most important and special of all the patriarchs, gets to choose the new emperor, which is a thing the patriarchs have always been able to do since always. So here you go, Charlemagne, you special boy. You're the new Roman Emperor, and not just that, you're the Holy Roman Emperor. May the record state that the Holy Roman Emperors were not Roman Emperors, and I will not be talking about them. The number of people who claim to be the new Roman Emperor is ridiculous. Germany, Spain, the Ottomans, the Russians. If I talked about them, I would basically have to cover the entirety of European history. So this was a big moment that really split the East and the West, but Charlemagne was still willing to make this work. Irene didn't have a son anymore, but she wasn't a man. So what if she just married Charlemagne herself? They each controlled about half of a Roman Empire, so they could just stick them together to make one big Roman Empire again. They could become more powerful than the Abbasid Caliphate. They could rule more land than Justinian. All Irene had to do was say yes. And then her finance minister overthrew her in a coup. He lied about there being someone else doing a coup, and the only way to stop the empress from being deposed was to depose her and make him the emperor instead. So they overthrew Irene. And then he went to war with Charlemagne because Mr. Finance Guy is the real Roman emperor and Charlemagne is a wannabe. All the opportunity of a reborn Roman Empire up in smoke. This new guy was named Nikephoros, and aside from ruining my alt-history fanfiction, he wasn't too shabby. He was still getting a hold of some land in Italy. That's pretty good after so many centuries after the fall of the West. But his dynasty was a bit of a disaster. Nikephoros brought his son with him to fight against the Bulgars. Then Nikephoros died in battle, and his son was sufficiently broken and maimed that nobody wanted him to rule them anymore. That guy's brother-in-law Michael comes to power. He loses a battle, it's embarrassing, and his general Leo is about to do a coup. Michael sees this coup coming, and so Michael coups himself first. Not in like a clever coup your own government to bolster power kind of way. Michael just banishes himself to a monastery and cordially invites Leo to become the new emperor. Just to be safe, Leo castrated all of Michael's sons anyway. This instability wasn't great, but the Byzantines didn't really have any existential threats at the moment, so things weren't as bad as they could have been. In fact, things were a little boring. They needed to keep themselves entertained, so Leo V outlawed pictures of Jesus again. Leo V ended up getting assassinated in quite dramatic fashion. A bunch of assassins dressed themselves up as choir boys, and then in the middle of Christmas Eve service, they threw off their robes and grabbed their swords. Somehow, they mistake the priest for Leo. They stab the priest to death. Leo grabs a big cross from the altar and is using it to battle for his life. He did not win though, that would have been pretty cool. The assassins dump him out in the snow and go down to the dungeons to free the guy they wanted to be the new emperor, this guy Michael II. Different Michael from the one that did a coup on himself. This Mike was in the prisons, you see, for conspiring against the emperor. Second time's a charm, it turns out. Now the trick to pulling off a coup is that you've got to do it fast enough that no one has time to organize a resistance or put any other kind of leadership in charge, which means the assassins bust Michael out of prison and run directly to the great big church in the middle of the city, the Hagia Sophia, which is where all of the emperors have their coronation ceremony. This ceremony involved Michael still wearing iron chains around his legs and a bunch of choir boy assassins giving him a crown that's probably got the last emperor's blood still on it. Not everybody was cool just to roll with that. There was an uprising for a number of years, but at the end of the day, Michael got away with it. Michael and his sons don't do anything that interesting. Michael lost more land to the Abbasid Caliphate, and his son Theophilos spends most of his time in charge fighting with the Caliphate some more. Best part of that war, though, was when Theophilos gave the Abbasids a whole bunch of money. I'm not talking as like an indemnity or a tribute payment or anything. He just sent guys to Baghdad to hand out money to everyone that was living there just to flex on them. Now that's how wars ought to be fought. Whichever country can provide for / bribe the other team's citizens better wins. Theophilos' wife rules for a good 14 years after Theophilos kicks the bucket. She re-legalizes pictures of Jesus, yeehaw. Then her son Michael III comes of age, and man, I just feel bad for this guy. His actual rule went fine. He was fighting with the Pope about which one of them had the right to decide who was the Patriarch of Constantinople, and again, following with the theme of settling conflicts in the best way possible, the Pope issues a challenge to the Byzantines. The Pope bets that his new partner, the Frankish Empire, can convert the Bulgars to Christianity before his ex-partner, the Byzantines, can. So this feud becomes like a My Fair Lady love triangle, where both teams are racing to convert the Bulgars into the right kind of Christians. The kind that knows who gets to appoint the Patriarch of Constantinople. And the Byzantines won. Good for them. No, the reason I feel bad for Michael III is because of the tragic love story between him and his courtier, Basil. Michael's boyfriend, Basil, is a complete sociopath. Like, if you remember Littlefinger from Game of Thrones, Basil is that to a T. Basil showed up in Constantinople one day as a random peasant looking for economic opportunity. Not a penny to his name, but he's hot. Like, insanely hot and totally jacked. Basil ends up making either friends or lovers out of like a priest and a wealthy widow, just hopping from person to person, making his way up the social ladder until he's suddenly hot and also rich and also has a job in the royal palace despite being completely illiterate because he's hooking up with the emperor. And then, the emperor pulls Basil into this weird pseudo-polycule situationship. Michael has a wife, but he's cheating on her with his mistress. His wife is getting suspicious about this lady hanging around the palace all the time, so Michael decides to marry his mistress to his boyfriend. Basil was unfortunately already married, and so Michael ordered him to get a divorce to make this plan work. Basil isn't happy about the divorce, so to make up for it, Michael lets Basil sleep with his sister. That's Michael's sister, not Basil's sister, but if he had a sister, he'd probably be sleeping with her too. Basil is sleeping with everybody. And he's using his special relationship with Michael to convince him that he can't trust anybody, and only Basil is looking out for him. And so Michael kills his family and makes Basil his co-emperor, at which point, as soon as Basil thinks Michael might be making eyes at another man, he kills Michael. He bids him goodnight with a kiss on the hand, knowing he was about to stab him through the heart. It's so good. It's just the most Judasy thing imaginable. You know the whole thing in Dante's Inferno about how Satan's got 3 mouths and is chewing on 3 traitors? I reckon you put Basil in there with Judas and Macbeth, you've got it made. So that's how a peasant with 0 experience or education literally slept his way to the top of the Roman Empire. And everyone just rolls with it. And it actually works out. Basil rules for 19 years. He reforms the law codes. He mends the latest schism with the Pope. He also lost control of Sicily because he redirected a fleet of ships to haul marble for his new church instead of taking back the island, but 2 out of 3 is not bad. This was the beginning of a Byzantine Renaissance. Basil died in 866. He was out hunting when his belt got caught on a deer's antlers and he was dragged for 16 miles by his pants. And Basil, who only thinks in terms of expedient murders, he wakes up to see a guy with a knife, who is the guy who cut him free, and he assumes this guy is an assassin who missed the chance to kill Basil while he was unconscious, and so he executes the man who saved his life the next day. But it was too late for Basil. He caught a fever and died. Basil was succeeded by his son Leo VI, whose slogan was justice. Because of the wife-swapping shenanigans, Leo was probably Michael III's son. Leo was very happy to hear that his maybe dad Basil was dead because they always kinda hated each other. Basil was very, very close to pulling an Irene and blinding his own son while he was young. The first thing that Leo does when he becomes emperor is to rebury his probably dad Michael III with high honors. Continuing with the theme of justice, Leo finished up Basil's law codes, and there are some fun stories about him sneaking out of the palace to play Batman. Take it with a grain of salt, but the story goes he would walk around looking for crime and injustice that he could correct. Supposedly, there was one time he got confronted by some guards. He bribed 2 of them, but the third one did his job and arrested him. The warden shows up to work the next day and sees the emperor in a jail cell and freaks out, but it's all good. The guard that did his job gets a reward, and the other 2 get fired. And maybe fried. I don't know what the punishment for bribery there was. Leo caused quite the controversy, marrying 4 times in an attempt to get a son, which he only got permission from the church to do as long as he outlawed 4th marriages for everybody else. Not just all the commoners, future emperors too. He finally managed to get that son a few years before he died, although he actually did that out of wedlock, and then tried to retroactively legitimize the boy by marrying the mother after he had been born. Leo kicked the bucket when the kid was only a few years old, so Leo's brother Alexander kept the throne warm for him for a few years. Alexander, whom we know was actually Basil's son because he was born after Michael III was brutally assassinated, Alexander was described by historians as just the worst. Not an empire-ending disaster, but just a really unpleasant guy to be around. He got into a war with the Abbasids and the Bulgarians, and then died of a stomach disease from drinking too much, leaving all of the problems he created to his 8-year-old nephew. That kid, Constantine VII, ruled for a stupidly long time, but almost never held power. Constantine VII, seen here looking like the Ice King, is described on Wikipedia as having a taciturn nature, very demure. Most of his article was about stuff other people used him to do, so very much a pushover. He was under the regency of the Patriarch of Constantinople for a bit, then his mother was in charge for a few years. She's got an awesome epithet, by the way. Zoe with coal black eyes. And when Zoe with coal black eyes fails to defeat the Bulgarians and is replaced by Admiral Romanos as the new regent, he takes full advantage of the emperor's pushoveriness. Romanos makes his daughter marry Emperor Constantine, and then Romanos makes himself co-emperor, and also makes his sons co-emperors. So for 2 decades, there's 4 or 5 Roman emperors running around, and the actual emperor, Constantine VII, isn't even first in line for his own crown. Credit where it's due though, Romanos was kicking butt and taking names as emperor. He made a decades-long peace with the Bulgarians. He had this general who was wrecking shop with the Abbasids all the way in Mesopotamia. I'm not sure if the Romans had sent an army that far away since before Persia was taken over by the Caliphate. The Russians, or more accurately the Kievan Rus, they make their first major appearance during his reign. They attack Constantinople while most of the Byzantine navy is out of town, only for Romanos to wreck them with Greek fire. The folks living in the Byzantine Empire at the time, for once had a good reason to feel hyped about being born in their time period. As Romanos gets older, he starts to feel bad about completely sidelining Constantine VII. Romanos' next-in-line son died, and he goes for about 10 years without naming another one of his sons as the next in line. So as Romanos is getting to be nearly 80 years old, his sons are a little worried that Romanos is going to die and Constantine VII is going to be the one to inherit the empire. So his two remaining sons force him into a retirement home, which is actually a monastery, on an island, because they arrested him. They would soon be joining him, however, because with Romanos gone, Constantine VII finally found a way to get rid of his wicked brothers-in-law. And he ends up also being a really solid ruler with a pretty good military record. He did land reform. He was really active in diplomacy with Otto the Great of Germany and the Emirate of Cordoba over in Spain. And Olga of Kiev, this famously badass and incredibly violent queen of the Rus, who is also a saint, because she showed up at Constantine's doorstep one day, not to attack Constantinople, just to chat. And she converted to Christianity, and then she went home. Nice? Constantine VII died in 959 after 46 years of being technically an emperor. That is good work for the Byzantines. Yeah, I don't think I really appreciated before making this video how much certain parts of the Middle Ages were actually a really good time for the Eastern Roman Empire. I always just imagined that their highlight reel was the parts where their empire was just dying slightly slower than usual. Constantine's son, Romanos II, is sort of a testament to that. He was one of those emperors that was very interested in drinking and courting pretty ladies and letting other people handle the actual work of running the empire, and in times past, that would have led to immediate collapse. But Romanos II waved his hand and sent his general to go recapture Crete, and hey, they recaptured Crete, without turning around and starting a civil war afterwards. Romanos II did die under mysterious circumstances at a young age, however, so maybe his strategy was less than foolproof. His two sons were both toddlers, so the empire was left under the regency of one of Romanos' generals. But there were checks and also balances, and Romanos' chief counselor was left in court to prevent the ambitious general from using his command of the army and connections to the aristocracy and power over the little baby emperor to usurp the throne. And then the general did it anyway. The poor counselor had a really solid strategy of closing the gates and letting the walls of Constantinople win the war for him, but it turns out the people of Constantinople didn't like checks and balances. They liked the general. But again, the people of Constantinople get a lucky break because even though the cycle of usurpation hasn't stopped, they just keep drawing these rulers who turn out to be really good at their jobs. The general that beat the counselor, his name was Nikephoros II, otherwise known as the Pale Death of the Saracens. How's that for an epithet? The Abbasid Caliphate was in tatters from infighting, and Nikephoros II went in and took back Antioch. The Byzantine Empire's got two patriarchs again. Holy moly, it has been ages. Nikephoros gets assassinated, but don't worry because the guy who killed him and took the throne, John Tzimiskes, is an even better general who reconquers huge swaths of Syria and the Levant, stopping just short of Jerusalem. That guy dies suddenly, but his successor is an even bigger deal. Meet Basil II. I was talking about him 500 years ago. Here he is, easily one of the top 5 Eastern Roman emperors. And he also reigns for an absurd amount of time. If you include the time he was a co-emperor as a kid, you're looking at 65 years. Basil II becomes emperor proper in 976 when he's 18 years old, the same year that John Tzimiskes suddenly died. There's still a bunch of guys out there who would prefer that Basil be a puppet so they can take power for themselves, but Basil puts his foot down. He's learned a fair bit of military skills from Nikephoros and John Tzimiskes, and Basil's got a reputation for being determined and occasionally even brutal in how effective he is. One of his strategies for making military headway was something that had a whole lot of consequences outside of Basil's own lifetime. The Kievan Rus are back for another little powwow. This time, a messenger from Grand Prince Vladimir shows up in Constantinople. Vladimir has captured the Byzantines' land in Crimea, but he's done some soul searching and now he really wants to be friends. The story goes, Vladimir was thinking about giving up on paganism, but he didn't know what religion he wanted to convert to. So he sent out scouts to travel the world and learn about Islam, Christianity, both Eastern and Western flavors, as well as Judaism. And I love the thought of an alternate reality where Russia went full-on Jewish. But ultimately, Vladimir concluded that the Jews losing their homeland was a sign that God didn't love them. Ouch! The scouts that came back from Constantinople, meanwhile, were telling Vladimir about how rich the Byzantines were, how it was just like heaven. And Vladimir decides that sounds like a religion he can get behind. So he converts to Orthodox Christianity, not just to make some rich new friends, but because their riches were proof that God was on their side, you see? To prove his devotion, Vladimir says he's going to give Crimea back to the Byzantines, and he's going to send soldiers to Basil, and he's going to change his own name to Basil, and all he wants in return is to marry Basil's sister. She was not too psyched about this because no Byzantine princess had ever married a barbarian before. But Vladimir promised to convert all of the Rus to Christianity, so Basil packed up his sister and shipped her off to Kiev. And that marriage and that conversion is why Russia would later end up staking its own claim to be the new Rome, just like Germany had done with the whole Holy Roman Empire thing. And this is where we get the famous Varangian Guard. There had actually been some Norse and some Rus serving in the Byzantine army for a long while, but the official Varangian Guard was the cohort of Rus soldiers that Basil made into his personal guard. Being Rus, they were less likely to be swayed by shifting Byzantine politics. And they were supposed to be some of the best warriors around, so that's a plus. Basil found an excellent use for them in his army, too. Despite his predecessors having a lot of success in the Middle East, Basil's primary focus was not on recapturing Jerusalem, but Bulgaria. It took him a long time to figure out exactly what to do with Bulgaria. He'd been stirring up drama to try and get the Bulgarians to fight themselves. He had a Bulgarian emperor that he held prisoner and then released him to go fight with the new Bulgarian leaders. But as soon as that Bulgarian emperor made it into Bulgaria, he was shot and killed because he was dressed up like a Byzantine nobleman. Basil then tried to promise his sister in marriage to one of the Bulgarians' leaders' brothers and get them to fight each other. And maybe they would become friends, just like the Rus. But that didn't work because the groom realized that the woman Basil had sent him was a fake. She was just some woman dressed up to look like a princess. The Rus were one thing, but the Bulgarians were a bridge too far, apparently. So Basil finally took to the battlefield, and if you've heard of Basil II before, you probably know he was called Basil the Bulgar Slayer, but his first attempt failed rather terribly. It wasn't until the year 1000 that the proper Bulgar slaying began. Basil had a fun interaction with the Tsar of Bulgaria, where each of them just charged into the other's empire to go looting. Basil goes all the way to the far side of the Bulgarian Empire and sacks their cities. So the Bulgarians go into the Byzantine Empire and sack their cities, but instead of rushing to relieve his subjects, Basil just leans into letting the Balkans get sacked and letting Constantinople ride it out behind the Theodosian walls. Because he had gone so deep into Bulgaria that he kind of had the entire Bulgarian Empire surrounded. When the war with Bulgaria was won in 1014, Basil reportedly captured 15,000 prisoners, sorted them into groups of 100, blinded 99 of them, and left the other guy with one eye in his head to lead all the others back home. So today, Basil II is a hero in Greece, and not so much in Bulgaria. Once he actually had a hold of Bulgaria, though, he was way more cool with the Bulgarians. He let a lot of them keep their positions of power, although some of them he would give a bunch of land to rule over in a different part of the Byzantine Empire, so that they would still be happy, but also they wouldn't be anywhere near their diehard supporters who would help them do a rebellion. By the time Basil II died in 1025, things were looking better than they had been for a long time. I kind of love this about the Byzantine Empire. They're just so good at surviving things that they can just wait 200 or 300 years until all of their neighbors collapse, and then the Byzantines are free to pick up the pieces. The Bulgarians were conquered. The Abbasid Caliphate was gone. The Byzantine Empire was in control of the Levant and Anatolia and Greece and Bulgaria. They controlled parts of Georgia and Armenia. They held land in southern Italy. Croatia and Venice were paying tribute. This was the best spot the empire had been in what? The 400 years at least. There was one place in which Basil II failed, however, and it was a pretty important one. He never married, and he never had kids. So when he died, the empire passed to his brother Constantine VIII. Technically, Constantine VIII had been a co-emperor this whole time, so you could argue that he was the longest-serving Roman emperor of all time, but he was also completely irrelevant. Like, Basil II was fully in charge. Constantine VIII was spending his time wrestling and riding horses and being a food connoisseur, which honestly sounds like the better gig. So when Constantine VIII took the throne, all of the Byzantine aristocrats did their best to try to pressure him into doing stuff for them. The man didn't even rule for 3 years, and his Wikipedia page has this to say about him. The start of the decline of the Byzantine Empire has been linked to Constantine's accession to the throne. His reign has been described as, quote, an unmitigated disaster, a breakup of the system, and the cause of, quote, a collapse of the military power of the empire, unquote. Constantine VIII also had only daughters, which on the one hand meant that this was going to be the end of the dynasty, but on the bright side, none of his daughters were married. They were all in their 50s, but Basil II had explicitly forbidden them from getting married so that their husbands couldn't challenge him. So before he dies, Constantine VIII has the opportunity to marry his oldest eligible daughter, Princess Zoe, to anyone he wants. He can choose any man in the world to become the next emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire and to carry on the legacy of Basil II. And on his deathbed, he chooses a man named Constantine, the Duke of Antioch, one of the royal family's most loyal supporters. The Duke of Antioch arrives in Constantinople to be crowned emperor, and someone has to tell him that actually, the aristocrats all wanted another pushover emperor who would give them Christmas presents. So at the last second, they convinced Constantine VIII, still in his deathbed, to pick somebody else before he died. That somebody was Romanos III, and he doesn't matter because he was a pushover emperor, but we will be talking about his wife. Empress Zoe had spent 50 years growing up in the ladies' room, by which I mean the room where they put all of the women, in the innermost part of the building where they would be out of sight and out of mind. Jesus. She was very concerned about continuing the dynasty and tried everything she could think of to get pregnant, but none of it was working, and it put a strain on her marriage, and she and Romanos III started sleeping apart, which is not very conducive to getting pregnant. So Zoe picked up a No, what do you call it if your mistress is a dude? Because master sounds gross. Is it just a lover? That's a little disappointing. Zoe takes a lover, and she's getting involved in politics, and Romanos doesn't really do anything about it because that's how he got the job. And then word gets around that Zoe is talking about making this new guy emperor. Romanos hears about this and confronts his wife's lover, who specifically denies that Zoe was planning to make him emperor, and that whatever Romanos has heard about one of the eunuchs seeing him and Zoe making out on the emperor's throne is definitely not true. So Zoe and her lover Michael decide Romanos needs to go away forever, and then Romanos got drowned to death in the bathtub on the exact same day that Zoe and Michael had planned to get married. What a wacky coincidence. I just like to imagine being the wedding planner in that scenario, where one of your clients already has a husband and is reassuring you that she will not have a husband by the time the big day arrives. But then Michael has a crisis. If Zoe could murder one husband, what's stopping her from one day murdering her second husband? So Michael throws her back into the ladies' room, which is exactly the kind of behavior that makes Zoe want to kill somebody. But believe it or not, Michael dies of natural causes. I guess Zoe liked him enough to only go after his political allies and not him personally. She didn't actually succeed in taking them all out, however, so when Michael dies, Zoe is still not given power, but instead forced to adopt Michael's nephew and then retire to a monastery. But now the emperor is some guy the public has never heard of, and the people of Constantinople riot until Zoe is put back in charge. Yay, girl power! Except she has to share with her sister Theodora. Yay, girl power. Zoe and Theodora did not get along. You spend 50 years sharing a room with your sister and see how you like it. So to get the edge over Theodora, Zoe decides to get married again, but she's got to pick carefully because, thanks to Leo VI marrying 4 times, the church allows exactly 3 marriages. 3 strikes, and then you're out. Zoe's options are the Duke of Antioch, named Constantine, her former lover, Constantine, or her other ex-lover, Constantine. She chooses the last Constantine, and he brings his mistress to the royal court and names her as an empress, basically, and Zoe is definitely going to get murdered. But no! Again, the public intervenes for whatever reason. They really love Zoe, and are genre savvy enough to see the writing on the wall, so they rise up to kill Constantine. And Zoe has to actually go out and tell everyone that he hasn't actually done any conspiring yet, so everybody go home. It's all chill. Zoe died of natural causes in the year 1050, handing Constantine the throne and sending Theodora to a convent. Constantine then had the distinct pleasure of watching the final split between the Eastern and Western Christian churches. The long and short of it is, the Pope and Constantine and the Holy Roman Empire all had a problem. The Normans were attacking Italy. Yes, the same Normans that came out of France and took over England in 1066. Probably not the same exact guys, that would have been wacky, but the same group of people. And so the Pope sends a papal legate, or a representative, to Constantinople to figure out what they're gonna do about the Normans. But while he's there, this legate is also going to have a friendly discussion about religion, specifically bread. A big thing in Christianity, both in Constantinople and Rome, as well as in most branches of Christianity today, is what's called the Lord's Supper, where Christians eat bread and drink wine in remembrance of Jesus' Last Supper. Now, historically, there has been some controversy over whether the bread or the wine transform into Jesus' flesh and blood in a literal sense as you eat them, or in a metaphorical sense, but that's not the problem with this story. In Constantinople, they liked to do this whole ritual with bread that had yeast in it, so it could be all nice and fluffy and chewy. And in Rome, they liked to do this with bread that was not all light and nice and chewy. In 1053, the Patriarch of Constantinople made a list of all the churches in the empire where those sons of bitches ate unchewy bread and shut them down, so that the good, nice, chewy bread Christians wouldn't be led astray. Then, in 1054, the papal legate shows up in Constantinople. He wants to know where this chewy bread motherfucker gets off banning the one true way of eating bread, and he fires the Patriarch of Constantinople in the name of the Pope. The Patriarch of Constantinople doesn't step down, and so the legate excommunicates him, which means by the power of the Pope, the Patriarch of Constantinople is no longer a Christian, and Jesus doesn't love him anymore. To which the Patriarch of Constantinople promptly excommunicated the legate, and they all went home having done nothing to stop the Normans from invading Italy. And thus, although the average Joe might not have even realized it at the time, the church in Rome and the church in Constantinople had officially, finally, split for good. The legate declared that the Pope is in charge of everyone because he's the best and is literally incapable of making mistakes, and this definitely real paper he has from Constantine I proves it. Fun fact, you want to know why the Catholic Church is called the Catholic Church? The word Catholic means complete, universal, lacking nothing. The Catholic Church is literally the in charge of everything because everyone who doesn't listen to me isn't a real Christian anyway church. It's so f***ing good. Then Constantine IX dies in 1055, giving Theodora 20 glorious months to be in charge. At age 76, Theodora was the last member of her dynasty, and all she had to do to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past was to name a successor, ideally marry him for bonus legitimacy points, and she crossed her arms and said, "No! What are you gonna do, kill me?" So once again, the nobles all gather and choose an emperor who is better at being ruled than he is at ruling. They take him to Theodora on her deathbed and ask if she approves of their choice. She's half dead and incapable of speech, but it kinda looked like she nodded there at the end, so they have the seal of approval. This new guy is called Michael the Warlike, which is funny because all he managed to do in his entire reign was upset the military and lose control of the empire in just under a year to one of his generals. That general is Isaac I of the Komnenos dynasty, named for his origins in the city of Komne, which I only bring up because that city is really close to the city of Philippopolis, which means that we were narrowly robbed of having a Philippopolitan dynasty. Speaking of fun names, Isaac Komnenos won control of the empire at the Battle of Hades. How cool is that? Isaac is a man who is poised to rule others. So he puts his foot down on a bunch of courtly shenanigans and makes some fiscal reforms so we can get things done around here, people. Those reforms included cutting the salary of the Roman Senate, who, surprise, are still here. These guys haven't done anything important in 1,000 years, but the empire's commitment to keeping them around is honestly remarkable. The Senate was the only thing that had been consistent all the way from the time Rome was a kingdom, literally from the time of Romulus. You know what it was? It's exactly like the British monarchy. The British keep a non-functional royal family for the sake of tradition, and the Romans did the same thing with the Republic. How awesome is that? Isaac Komnenos got sick 2 years after becoming emperor, and the Komnenos dynasty died with him. And now things are about to get really bad again. As a matter of fact, the next dynasty, the Ducases, are kind of the worst. Or should I say, the worst so far. The first Ducas, Constantine X, used his emperor position to put all of his supporters in important and cushy positions, regardless of whether or not they knew how to run things, and then cut the military's budget, disbanded the militias in the frontier, and replaced a bunch of his standing army with mercenaries, because, I mean, hey, there hasn't been a major military threat since Basil II took care of the Bulgarians, and if somebody new shows up, there's going to be some warning. I mean, when has a major military power in the Middle East suddenly sprung up out of nowhere? So Armenia got conquered by the Seljuk Turks, who were a major military power that appeared out of nowhere and took over a lot of the Middle East. The Hungarians took over land in the Balkans, and a good chunk of southern Italy got taken over by the Normans. Constantine dies in 1067, leaving his wife in charge of his 2 sons, and he makes her promise that no one will become emperor except those boys. She is explicitly not allowed to remarry someone and make him emperor. And you know, she was gonna keep her promise, but after one of her generals tried to steal the throne, she was a little worried about how long she could realistically keep a lid on future rebellions. So while the imprisoned general was awaiting sentencing, she comes down to meet him and says he's not in trouble actually for trying to steal the throne, and actually, she's going to marry him and make him the emperor. Not a bad deal. His real punishment would be how horribly his emperorship went. He wasn't even that bad of an emperor. His name was Romanos IV. He was a good general, and his whole thing as emperor was that he was going to get the army back in good shape and take the fight to the Seljuks before they became too big of a threat. But his army was just not up to task after what Constantine X had done to it, and he lost the Battle of Manzikert, and if I'm naming the battle, you know it's going to be bad. Romanos IV was captured in battle, and in one fell swoop, the Byzantine Empire lost pretty much all of modern Turkey, all of its holdings in Asia, just gone. Thank God for the Byzantines that Basil had reconquered the Balkans instead of playing in the Middle East, or they wouldn't have anything left. Romanos IV getting captured was very convenient to get Constantine X's son Michael VII on the throne, but Michael was very much not ready to rule. He's easily manipulated, which leads to his finance minister calling the shots, and boy are they some crappy shots. The empire has just suffered one of its greatest defeats in its entire history, and he decides that living it up in Constantinople is actually way more important than paying the army. And the Seljuks continue conquering Turkey, and the Normans finally take over the Byzantines' very last holdings in Italy. R.I.P. One of the generals begs with the Emperor Michael to please do something about any of this. Just one thing. That would be fine. Michael is severely offended. The general doesn't want to get executed, so he goes ahead and rebels, becoming emperor himself in 1078. He spends his entire reign putting down revolt after revolt, dodging assassination attempts until eventually one of his generals succeeds and becomes the emperor, and that guy's name was Alexios Komnenos. Hey, look, the Komnenos dynasty is back. After the worst decade for the Byzantines since the rise of Islam, Alexios Komnenos is finally able to stem the bleeding. And we know a lot about his heroic deeds and how heroic they were because his daughter wrote an entire history book about him, and she called it the Alexiad, as if he were some figure straight out of an ancient epic poem. Personally, I think Alexios' most impressive accomplishment was the fact that he actually managed to break through the Theodosian walls to become emperor in the first place. But after that, Alexios paid off the Germans to fight with the Normans, so the Normans would stop invading the Balkans, then had to deal with some heretics conspiring with a bunch of nomads to attack the Balkans. I keep specifying the Balkans as if the Byzantines had any territory in Italy or the Middle East. Well, actually, they may not have had any territory, but Italy and the Middle East were about to make things interesting in a big way. Alexios wants some mercenaries to try to take back Turkey, so he asks the Pope if he can borrow some. And the Pope's response was wild. He sees a great opportunity to show the Byzantines why the Pope is the best, most Christian ever, and why they should all follow him. And he sees it as an awesome opportunity to get Western Europe to stop fighting with itself. He calls on the Christians of Europe, but especially France, to make war with the Seljuk Turks and reclaim land for the Byzantines. He calls for the First Crusade. The response from the Christians of Europe, and especially France, was even wilder. They came out in droves with little more than a weapon and a vague notion of reclaiming the Holy Land. Back in Constantinople, Emperor Alexios gets word that there is an enormous army in the Balkans, but it's not the First Crusade. It is an army of poorly armed and completely untrained peasants, and one very enthusiastic preacher who heard about the First Crusade and decided to make his own dime store version. This army would like one ticket to the Holy Land, please, and also they are very hungry and have no money and no food. Alexios was expecting some mercenaries, not an army with zero supplies. He cannot feed these people. And so they tear their way through the Balkans, looting and pillaging the empire they were supposed to be helping. Alexios cobbles together a way to get them to the Seljuks as fast as possible, where they are all promptly slaughtered. But then a few months later, Alexios gets word that there's another army of Catholics in the Balkans. These guys are the actual First Crusade, a real army with weapons and knights and commanders, meaning they're probably going to be a lot better behaved. But if not, they could do a lot more damage. Alexios wastes no time in making them leave his empire as fast as possible. He tells them he's going to give them food and a ride to fight the Seljuks as long as they promise to give him whatever lands they conquer. The First Crusade generally goes pretty well. The Turks mopped the floor with the disorganized mess of zealots that came through earlier, but they're not ready for the second wave of actual soldiers. Alexios sends a couple of his generals and their armies to go with the Crusaders, and Alexios gets some cities back. It is the first and last time that any of the Crusades are remotely useful for the Byzantine Empire. When the Crusaders reach the city of Antioch, they're having a hard time laying siege to the city, and one of the Crusader generals runs back towards Constantinople and tells Alexios and his armies that it's a lost cause. So Alexios and his armies are like, that's a bummer, and they turn around. The Crusaders actually do win that siege, and so Alexios thanks them for bravely reconquering Antioch for him, and the Crusaders tell him that no, he didn't fight for Antioch, so he doesn't get to have it. The Crusaders are going to take it for themselves. It's theirs now. Alexios is probably very confused because the Pope asked the Crusaders to come here in the first place to help the Byzantine Empire. Nobody forced them to come here. But the Crusaders had their own ideas. They ended up taking over a good chunk of land all the way down to Jerusalem, and they kept it for themselves, albeit I'm pretty sure with some infighting over exactly who got what. So it may not have been Basil II levels of triumph, but any step away from the precipice of doom is a good step. I wrote that line before researching the next emperor. I swear it is not a setup for the next guy to be terrible, and the next guy was pretty good too. Good work, Komnenoi. So, Anna, Alexios' daughter who wrote the epic history book about her dad, she actually had a decent bid to either become empress flat out in her own right, or make her husband the emperor and rule through him. But apparently her husband was not interested. He was a simple man who didn't want to be part of no coup. So the next emperor after Alexios was Anna's brother, I believe, John the Beautiful, who is described by historians as being, quote, short and unusually ugly. Oof. John was... I get the impression he was a guy who was always very serious. You know, even when he's mingling and partying and making jokes, he's always very tuned in and calculated. He would be very flashy and ostentatious when it served some political purpose, but otherwise, he was a guy who didn't want anything fancy. He was very religious, and he wanted his conversations to be all business. If he were in a movie, it would be all about how he needs to lighten up and have fun, like all the normal people. But it turns out being serious all the time makes you a pretty good emperor. We don't have tons of records about what he got up to inside of the empire, mostly just a lot of records about all of the wars he went on. He seems more like a Justinian than a Basil II to me. He was trying to expand the empire in all directions at once. He was fighting with the Seljuks over Anatolia. He had to go cover an invasion from nomads in the north. He got into a fight with Venice. He got tangled up in Hungary's drama. And then he went to war with the Serbs for getting involved on the wrong side of the war with Hungary. That one was interesting. The Byzantines were still employing their unique strategy of defeating people in the Balkans and then forcibly relocating them into Anatolia to help them defend against the Caliphate or the Seljuks or whatever big scary empire was out there. It's kind of amazing that having two enemies in the east instead of just one never came back to bite them hard enough to make them stop doing it. We're not done with John's wars, though. More wars with the Turks in Anatolia, and then he turned his attention south to deal with the Crusader kingdoms. He fought all the way through southern Anatolia and conquered a bunch of cities just so he could show up at Antioch and remind the guys in charge they were supposed to be part of the Byzantine Empire. In the years since the First Crusade, the Crusaders' opinion was pretty much that yeah, legally speaking, these cities should probably belong to the Byzantines, and the Byzantines can have them when they can back up their claims with force. So when John showed up all of a sudden with an army that just cleaved its way through the Seljuks to get to Antioch, the Crusaders are all a little freaked out and fall in line, which saved John the trouble of having to conquer them, but he may have counted a little too heavily on their loyalty. John is thinking, this is great. He's just won like 10 wars in the last 20 years, and now he's got all these vassals in Antioch and Jerusalem and whatnot, so they're going to help him take over Syria from the Muslims. And John is supposedly doing everything right. You know, he's this devout Christian who is leading his armies at the front line, the sort of thing you'd think would be very inspiring to a crusader. But when John went charging into battle, his crusader allies were still in their camps playing dice. So John gets as far as getting a part of Syria to pledge loyalty to him and pay him a bunch of money because John has a really good track record with these wars. But then he had to leave because some other part of his empire was being raided, and then he had to go meet with the Germans about containing the Normans in Italy. John the Beautiful's calendar was packed. When that's finally done, John goes all the way back to Antioch, deciding that if you want to do something right, you've got to do it yourself. It is time to conquer the city outright. Just as soon as he goes on a hunting trip, he accidentally scratched himself with a poisoned arrow and died. Time to spin the wheel again. What'll it be? Good king, bad king, civil war? Monarchies are so much fun. The new guy is called Manuel I, and the first major crisis he has to deal with is another crusade. The Seljuks were attacking some of the Crusader states. They actually managed to take over one of them, so Germany and France agreed to send an army to help them out. This is not good news for Manuel. The way he reacted, you'd think he was being invaded, because that's pretty much what this was. There is a giant army moving through his lands that he is not allowed to attack, but also the littlest thing could set them off and cause them to start raiding and pillaging again. It's like herding particularly violent cows. Manuel fortifies the defenses of Constantinople and sends his army to escort the Crusaders and get them out of his territory as fast as possible. And even once they reached the Holy Land, the Crusaders continued to be a thorn in his side, especially, believe it or not, Antioch. Manuel was late in paying the Prince of Antioch for helping out with another crusade against the Turks, and it turned out the Prince of Antioch needed money, like so bad you'd think he'd borrowed money from the mob to score coke. So when Manuel's payment is late, Prince Renaud attacks the Byzantine-owned island of Cyprus. He spends 3 weeks there, looks like he killed or maimed a bunch of people, broke into the monasteries, took all their stuff, then saw the Byzantine fleet coming to punish him and hightailed it out of there. But not before taking some hostages with him for good measure. And then when Manuel's army follows him all the way to Antioch, Renaud realizes, yes, I may have miscalculated. But he gets away with it through the most diabolical scheme of all. He overwhelms Emperor Manuel with cringe. Renaud rides out to meet the Byzantine army and call for a parley. He goes up to the emperor wearing some kind of rough clothes or a sack or something. He throws himself on the ground. He's got a rope around his neck and is like gripping a sword by the blade and his hands bleeding. He's offering the handle of the sword to the emperor, probably groveling about being a piece of garbage and wanting to be killed and how sorry he is. And the actual medieval source, this guy William of Tyre, explicitly lays out how long Reynaud lay there for and how embarrassing it was. But it must have worked, because after marching Reynaud through the streets of Antioch to add insult to insult, Reynaud got to keep his job as the Prince of Antioch. Second Crusade was a bit of a wash overall, but Manuel got some good PR out of it, and hey, he reconquered Isauria, that place with the hillbillies where the one emperor was from. Woo! I love continuity. Oh, and guess what? The Byzantines are sending troops to Italy again. Yeah, Manuel I had a plan to reconquer parts of southern Italy. He landed just as the Norman king died, and a whole bunch of his vassals were revolting against the new guy, so Manuel slid on in there, invited Germany and the Pope to come get a piece of the action. Things were going really well. The Byzantines' old provincial capital, back when they still controlled southern Italy, the people in that city threw open their gates and welcomed the Roman Empire in with a cheer. Unfortunately for them, the campaign ended in kind of a dumb way. Not even like a funny dumb way. A couple of the commanders got into a fight, and the campaign just sort of lost momentum. And then the Normans started winning, and then the Normans kept winning, and then the Byzantines had to leave Italy, never to return. Even the Pope was kind of bummed out about this. He thought the Byzantines would make way better neighbors than the Normans. Plus, he was in a fight with the Holy Roman Empire, and so the thought of getting back together with his ex was really tempting. But it could never work. Manuel really wanted to have secular control over the Papal States, and the Pope really wanted to have religious control over all the other patriarchs and the Emperor. They really tried, though. Everyone in Constantinople was making fun of the Pope for saying that when Jesus called God the Father greater than himself, he meant that God is greater than Jesus' human nature, but equal to Jesus' divine nature. Isn't that just the silliest thing you've ever heard? And Manuel really tried to walk the line of saying that it wasn't that silly. Maybe this Pope guy has some good ideas. And maybe anyone who disagrees should have all of their property confiscated. God, I love the church. They were also hotly debating questions like, when Jesus sacrificed himself on the cross to pay for mankind's sins, did he only make the sacrifice to God the Father and the Holy Spirit, or did he also sacrifice himself to himself? Manuel's ambitions also fizzled out in Egypt. Egypt wasn't part of a ginormous caliphate anymore, so Manuel had big dreams of taking it over with the help of the Crusader states, but he could never make it happen. He lost the battle to the Seljuks, and it really started to look like Manuel was getting ahead of himself. The Komnenoi so far feel like they just really wanted to be Justinian, but they just needed like another century or so. They would not get another century. As a matter of fact, Constantinople would fall less than 25 years after Manuel's death. The year is 1180. Manuel has just died. Who's in charge next? Manuel had tried for many years to have a son, and was almost ready to throw in the towel and give the entire empire to the King of Hungary. Wild timeline that would be. But no, he finally succeeded, and the empire shall pass to his son Alexios II. No problem. Alexios is only 11 years old. No problem. Alexios' mother Maria is in charge until her son is old enough. Maria is a Catholic. Okay, now we have a problem. The people of Constantinople have never been the biggest fan of Catholics because on top of Catholics being heretics, most of the Catholics that the average Constantinopolitan would have encountered were the ultra-rich traders from Venice, Pisa, Genoa, all the guys who had taken over the city's ports and harbors. So Maria's stepdaughter, Maria Jr., gets the help of the Orthodox Church to rebel against her stepmother in a holy war. That doesn't work. So Maria Jr. gets some help from a guy named Andronikos. And just bear in mind that while all of these civil wars are happening, the Byzantine Empire is losing territory again. Andronikos successfully takes over Constantinople. The people of Constantinople get a little overexcited in celebrating the arrival of Andronikos, and they start killing any Catholics they can find. Women, children, bedridden hospital patients. They even killed a delegate sent from Rome, cut off his head, and tied it to a dog's tail to be dragged through the streets. Andronikos didn't tell the angry mob to do any of that, but he also didn't tell them to stop. They were very special, and he loved them. Andronikos thanked Maria Jr. for the invitation by killing her, and then he killed Maria Sr. and subjected her to the very old Roman tradition of damnatio memoriae, i.e., trying to remove every public reference to her out of existence. Hell yeah, continuity. And then like a year later, Andronicus killed the child emperor Alexios II and takes the throne for himself. Andronicus spent his reign curbing the power of the aristocracy, and in so doing, blinded enough of his enemies to earn the title Misophaes, the hater of sunlight. That is metal as hell. But what ultimately cost him the throne was when the Normans invaded Greece with some kid pretending to be the dead child emperor of Alexios II. Talk about karma. Normans took over a really important city, threatened to attack Constantinople for a bit, and now the people of Constantinople, who had been so happy to be ruled by Andronicus that they killed tens of thousands of Catholics, were incredibly unhappy about being ruled by Andronicus. There's an uprising, and in the middle of it, the people find this dude hiding in the Hagia Sophia. His name was Isaac Angelos, and the reason he was in there was because he had been involved in an entirely different revolt earlier, and now he was hiding in the church, praying that the emperor wouldn't kill someone inside of a church. But the people lift up Isaac Angelos and proclaim him the leader of this new revolt. Andronicus Komnenos tries to flee the city, but the people catch him and bring him to Isaac Angelos to face justice, which was probably very awkward for both Isaac and Andronicus. Isaac does not want to be in charge of this situation and lets the mob decide what to do with the emperor, and they tie him to a post, cut off his hand, and pull at his hair and teeth until they rip out of his body. They gouged out his eyes, threw boiling water in his face, and beat the living daylight out of him for 3 days. And then they took him to the chariot racing arena, hung him upside down, argued over who could stab him better, but ultimately settled their differences by ripping his body apart. Of all the Roman emperors who could have died this way, I really question the decision to choose Andronicus. There must have been something in the water during his reign that just turned everybody bloodthirsty. So Isaac Angelos is in charge now. Do you remember the Ducas dynasty? The ones who inherited a golden age, spent the army's budget on lining their friends' pockets, and suffered one of the empire's worst military defeats since the founding of Rome. Remember when I said the Ducas dynasty was the worst dynasty so far? That's because the Angelos dynasty is worse. Isaac locks down a royal marriage and successfully retakes that city in Greece that got Andronicus killed for losing it, which must have been a huge weight off of his shoulders. But past that point, he was less successful. He sent a fleet to the Holy Land, Normans sank it. The Komnenos family won't let go of Cyprus. All of these failed military expeditions are being paid for with high taxes that made Bulgaria rebel and turn itself back into the Bulgarian Empire. That wasn't supposed to happen. Then another crusade came to town, relations between the Byzantines and the Crusaders broke down, and the Crusaders beat the Byzantine army and pillaged all the way to the Holy Land. Wild that the Crusades were originally pitched to help the Byzantines. One day, Isaac is going to war with the Bulgarian Empire when in Constantinople, his older brother Alexios III asks the people of Constantinople very nicely if he can become the emperor, and he becomes the emperor. When Isaac comes back, Alexios throws him in prison and scoops out his eyes. But Alexios III promises he's really not a bad guy, and to prove it, he empties the empire's treasury, presumably giving people favors and bread and circuses, and giving his soldiers lots of money and time off and whatnot. Problem with doing that when your empire is actively collapsing, the Hungarians, Bulgarians, and the Seljuk Turks gang up on the Byzantine Empire and take the very last of their lunch money. The only friends the Byzantines had were the Serbians until that fell through, and they had 0 allies. When diplomacy failed, Alexios tried to strengthen his outer provinces, and they pretty much said thanks and started acting independently, so instead of losing his territory to the Turks, he lost it to his own noblemen. So who was going to capture Constantinople first? The Hungarians? The Serbs? Bulgarians? Turks? Provincial nobles? No, it's the biggest threat of them all, the Crusaders. Europe launches the Fourth Crusade, and the Crusaders made it as far as Venice before they ran out of money. Venice didn't want a bunch of cranky vagrants in their country any more than the Byzantines did, so Venice said they would pay for the boats to send the Crusaders to attack the Holy Land or Egypt or whatever it is they think they're doing, as long as the Crusaders attacked some of Venice's enemies along the way. So the Crusaders go and sack this Christian city. They have basically become the world's largest band of bandits/mercenaries. And you know who could really use a huge mercenary army right now? Isaac Angelos is blind and in jail, but his son, Alexios IV, managed to escape with both of his eyes. Alexios IV talks with the leaders of the crusade and asks them if they would be willing to make one more detour. If they would stop by Constantinople, dethrone Alexios III, and put in Alexios IV, Alexios IV promises, pinky promises, that he's going to convert everyone in his empire to Catholicism, and pay the Crusaders lots and lots of money, because, as far as he knows, there's still a lot of money left in the vault. The Crusaders think lots of money is a great idea, and so they divert their army away from reclaiming the Middle East and attack one of the holiest sites in Christendom. And they did it pretty easily too, because the Emperor Alexios III offered no resistance. His ministers kept telling him to defend the city, but instead, he ran away, taking a bunch of treasure with him. Without a proper defense, the Crusaders scaled the wall and lit the city on fire. The city that stood up to the mightiest caliphate for centuries was overrun by a bunch of Catholic mercenaries in 3 weeks. The Crusaders put Alexios IV on the throne, and Alexios goes to deliver the payment he promised, but oh yeah, Alexios III already bankrupted the empire and ran away with as much treasure as he could carry. And forget about converting the empire to Catholicism. The Crusaders are starting to get angry, so Alexios IV starts looting his own city, melting down every priceless artifact and religious icon he can get a hold of, but he's still short by about half the amount he's promised. Alexios IV is caught between the Crusaders, who are angry at him for not paying them what he promised, the citizens of Constantinople, who are angry at him for destroying their religious icons and burning their houses down, Alexios III, who is still out there somewhere being mad at him with an army, and his own father Isaac, who was mad at his son for being a complete failure. Alexios IV begged the Crusaders for an extension and started to scrounge up a little extra money by going to war with Alexios III and sacking more Byzantine towns, but while he was out of Constantinople, violence broke out between the Crusaders and the local citizens, which led to the Crusaders lighting the city on fire for a second time. When Alexios IV comes back to Constantinople, he finally accepts that he will never be able to pay the Crusaders, so he may as well act tough about it. He declares that he will do no more than what he has already done, and even lights a few of the Crusaders' ships on fire to prove his point. That certainly doesn't go over well with the Crusaders, but before they can even retaliate, Alexios IV is deposed in favor of a different Alexios from the House of Ducas, because things are so bad for the Byzantines that the second most disgraced royal house sounds like an amazing deal. Things under him break down into war with the Crusaders, and the Crusaders burn down the city for a third time. In the end, the Crusaders won, and they turned Constantinople into another Crusader state, just like Jerusalem or Antioch. But somehow, this was not the end for the Byzantine Empire. The story of the Roman Empire is the story of an eternal dumpster fire, eternally chaotic and self-defeating, and yet inexplicably unable to die. When Constantinople fell in 1204, there were like half a dozen different rump states, all claiming to be the empire's legitimate successors. In Constantinople, you had what's called the Latin Empire, since the Byzantines called the Catholics Latins. The man in charge of the Latin Empire was going to be a man named Boniface, but Venice didn't like that idea. They thought he was going to be too nice to the Byzantine royal family since they were his in-laws, so Venice gave Constantinople to somebody else instead. Boniface then went out, and because he was so kind to the Byzantines, he conquered their second largest city, Thessalonica, along with the eastern half of Greece. The kingdom of Thessalonica didn't last long before it was conquered by the western half of Greece, which is where Alexios III ran off to. Western Greece was originally called Epirus or Epirus, except after they took over the kingdom of Thessalonica, they started calling themselves the Empire of Thessalonica just to be confusing. By the time that happened, Alexios III had already been captured by the Empire of Nicaea, which was in southwest Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and was ruled by a former Byzantine nobleman. Then you had the Empire of Trebizond, which controlled some land around the coast of the Black Sea and was ruled by a branch of the Komnenos dynasty. Fun fact about them, their little kingdom actually managed to outlive the Byzantine Empire by a few years, and that is the last thing I will ever say about them because they were tiny and didn't matter. The main players are Epirus, Nicaea, and the Latin Empire. Nicaea starts out with the best odds of taking back Constantinople. They're fighting with the Latin Empire, and they manage to take over some land in both Anatolia and in the Balkans. Then they lose a fight with the Bulgarians, and all of a sudden it looks like Epirus is going to be the winner. Except Epirus tries to conquer the Bulgarians first, and they lose even harder than Nicaea did. Nicaea then jumps back into the fray, into the Balkans, takes Thessalonica away from Epirus, and surrounds Constantinople on both sides. In 1260, the Empire of Nicaea lays siege to Constantinople but can't get through until 1261, when the Nicaeans found a secret entrance into the city, allowing them to break in and open the gates from the inside, causing the empire to unfall. The Roman Empire, even when it's killed, it doesn't die. Now, we've sort of rushed through the last half century, so let's take a second to take stock of where we are. The current Byzantine emperor is Michael VIII from the house of Palaiologos, and he's actually just taken power away from the old Nicaean royal family. The Byzantines have been cut some huge slack during this whole unfalling business because the Turks were just wrecked by the Mongol Empire in the 1240s, and the Mongols stopped just short of attacking the Byzantines. This gave them the privilege of being able to ignore everything going on in Anatolia for just a second and worry about the West alone. The Byzantines still had an army and a navy, but they were extremely expensive for an empire that was a lot smaller than it used to be. The future of the Byzantine Empire would mostly depend on the emperor's ability to convince everybody within 1,000 miles that they didn't want to conquer the empire, actually. Easier said than done. Besides the Bulgarian and Serbian empires on the Byzantines' doorstep, there was also the matter of the Pope. When the Byzantine Empire unfell, it was also un-Catholikified, and the Pope would really prefer it to be re-Catholikified. In 1267, the Pope called on the King of Sicily to do him a favor and invade Constantinople and put the Catholics back in charge of things over there. Emperor Michael VIII told the Pope he was actually just getting around to reuniting the churches and that the invasion was totally unnecessary. And because Michael VIII used his Jedi mind trick powers, the Pope believed him and told the King of Sicily that the invasion was off. Then the Pope died. The next Pope thought that Michael VIII was a stinky liar, and he told the King of Sicily that the invasion was back on. So Michael VIII had to get creative. If he can't persuade the Pope, and he can't persuade the Sicilians, who can he persuade? Answer? Spain! He paid the King of Spain, or more specifically Aragon, a bunch of money to go start a revolution in Sicily. And it all went swimmingly. Not a hint of irony there. This is me being so for real right now. Unfortunately, just as soon as that fire got put out, a new one started in Anatolia. A new family of Turks called the Ottoman Empire had started to gather a lot of power, and the dying Michael VIII tagged in his son Andronikos II to stop them. Credit where it's due, Andronikos had a lot of ideas for how to fix the problem, but every time some screw came loose and the entire thing fell apart. He fought them pretty straightforwardly with his army, but the general in charge of that campaign revolted and had to be put down. So Andronikos puts his son in charge of the army so that he'll always be loyal, but he also sucks. So he tries Spain again. Andronikos buys a whole bunch of mercenaries from Catalonia. Goodness only knows where he got the money. And they beat back the Turks. And then it looks like Andronikos got into a fight with the mercenaries. His son kills the mercenaries' leader, and the mercenaries start burning and pillaging the Byzantine Empire at the exact same time that the Bulgarians also decided to attack and burn and pillage. It's a party, and everyone's invited. Andronikos decides maybe he can get some help from the Mongols in Persia, but they're not interested. Then Emperor Andronikos' son died, and Andronikos II got into a fight with his grandson, Andronikos III, which turned into a civil war. The civil war lasts for 7 years, and by the end of it, the Byzantine Empire controls just a strip of land in the Balkans and a couple scraggly patches of Anatolia. Andronikos III is the new emperor. He looks around, sees everything on fire, but he's not sweating it because he knows the Byzantines have bounced back before. He takes up the fight against the Ottomans, and the Ottomans take everything he owns in Anatolia. But he made up for it by retaking Epirus, which was also kind of a flaming dumpster fire on its own. And then Andronicus III dies, and there's another civil war, and oh, guess what? Also the Black Death. And we're arguing about Jesus again. If we pray to Jesus, are we feeling God's essences or his energies? Then we got earthquakes. The Byzantines didn't need all of that infrastructure anyway. All the while, the Ottomans, Bulgarians, and Serbs are taking over all their land, and Epirus got so fed up with everything, they just left in the middle of one of the Byzantines' civil wars. And that is Byzantine bingo. So first came injury, now comes the insult. The Byzantine Empire cannot continue to survive without any allies, so Emperor John V takes a trip to Hungary asking for help. Hungary says, fat chance. That sounds like a crusade, and they're not going on any crusades until the Pope asks them to, so John had better convert to Catholicism. So in 1369, John travels personally to Rome, the very first emperor to set foot in the city since Emperor Constans II robbed the place in the 600s. John threw himself at the feet of the Pope and admitted that the Pope wins. The Pope really is the best and the coolest and in charge of everyone, and John will convert to Catholicism. The Pope said that's nice, but did diddly squat to actually help. By 1371, all that was left of the empire that once spanned from Scotland to Mesopotamia was Constantinople, Thessalonica, and a little bit of land in the south of Greece. The Ottomans had crossed into Europe and surrounded Constantinople on both sides, and with no help coming from the west, the Byzantines were forced to become an Ottoman vassal. Yeah, the emperor's son wasn't too happy about becoming an Ottoman vassal, so he rebelled against his dad. Funny enough, this happened at the exact same time that the Ottoman emperor's son rebelled against his dad. So the Ottoman and the Byzantine emperors got to bond over the troubles of fatherhood. You'd think that would help the two empires get along better, but no. Actually, with every twist and turn of the Civil War and all the other drama that happened over the next 10 years, the Byzantine emperor and his son kept promising more and more things to the Ottoman Sultan so that he would help them take power. In the end, John kept his throne and owed the Ottomans more than when he started. Nice going, kid. In 1390, there was another rebellion against John. His grandson this time, John VII, takes power, but finally, all of John V's schmoozing paid off, at least a little. The Catholics liked John V because he converted to Catholicism, and the Ottomans liked John V because he wasn't causing problems for them. So John V's non-rebellious son, Manuel, goes asking for help. He wants an army to put his dad back on the throne. They like his dad, he likes his dad, everyone's got that in common, right? What seems to have happened is that the Ottomans say yes, they like his dad, but they don't like Manuel. So Manuel can have his army, or his money, or however they decided to help him, but there's a catch. When Manuel puts his dad back on the throne, Manuel has to return to the Ottoman court and live as their captive. Then, when John V dies, either Manuel will take the throne as an obedient vassal, or the Ottomans are going to put that grandson, John VII, back in charge. Manuel takes the deal. He puts his dad back on the throne, doesn't kill John VII, and he goes to the Ottomans to live as their captive. And in a cruel twist of irony, the Ottomans force him to help them capture the last Christian city in Anatolia. He's not there for long, though. Constantinople's population had plummeted since its heyday, and John V decided it would be good to put some of those rundown buildings in town to good use by tearing them down and using the resources to build up the city's defenses. The Ottomans were deeply offended at the idea that their vassal would ever want to protect itself from them, and they threatened to blind Manuel if the defenses get built. John V scraps the idea and then dies in humiliation just a few months after Manuel went to all of that work to put him back in charge. With the throne vacant, Manuel escapes from the Ottomans and zooms back to Constantinople as fast as he can before John VII can come back to power. Manuel makes it in time. He becomes the next Byzantine emperor, but John VII is still a threat. Manuel warns the people of Constantinople that John VII is conspiring to seize Constantinople and surrender the city to direct Ottoman control. The Ottomans are in fact thinking about doing things the sneaky way by replacing Manuel with John VII, but in 1394 they decide they would rather just conquer Constantinople flat out. So they build an enormous castle directly across the water and lay siege to the city. The only thing that could save the Byzantines now is if they somehow found a way to stop fighting with each other and put their love for their country over their love for power. And no true Byzantine would ever do that. And then they do! In a rare story of humanity, Manuel and John realize they may not like each other, but they both love their home. They set their differences aside. Manuel adopts John VII as his son and heir, and John VII adopts Manuel's children as his sons and heirs. Manuel tells John that the city and what's left of the Roman Empire is in peril, and he needs to find allies to come to their aid. So in the ultimate act of trust, Manuel leaves John in charge of the empire, while Manuel sets sail in search of allies. The Ottomans think this is a dream come true. The Sultan tells John VII he will trade Constantinople for a governorship in any province in the Ottoman Empire, and John VII tells him where he can shove his promises. Constantinople might be weak, and old, and underpopulated, and without any committed allies, but they have the power of God on their side. The God who likes fluffy bread, so come at him. Manuel, meanwhile, spends 3 years traveling to Italy, France, England, and sends delegates to Spain and Denmark. He's giving away such holy relics as the Holy Sponge. So great was his need and generosity. Help from the Europeans never comes. But help from the Turks does. Out of nowhere, this guy Timur started conquering huge swaths of land in Central Asia like he's the second coming of Genghis Khan. The Ottomans went to war with him, and the Ottoman Sultan was captured in battle, dying in captivity a few months later. The Ottomans have no rules for succession. His sons tear the Ottoman Empire apart in a 4-way free-for-all civil war that would last for 10 years. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, John VII handed power back over to Manuel, just as he promised. One would think God really was on their side, because that was a miracle. Manuel makes the most of the time he was given and begins to make small conquests in a region of southern Greece called the Morea, which is this little chunk here at the bottom that looks like an island but isn't quite. There's actually a tiny strip of land that connects the Morea to the rest of Greece, and that is exactly where Manuel builds a big wall to keep out invaders. It wasn't much, but it was something, and if the Ottomans wanted to take it, the Byzantines would be ready. Turns out, the Ottomans didn't want to take it, actually. The Sultan that won the 10-year civil war in the Ottoman Empire was super chill. He even paid Manuel to look after some political prisoners who had tried to make themselves Sultan. It was as good as it could get. But eventually, the chill Ottoman Sultan dies, and Manuel thinks it would be awesome if the Ottomans had another civil war. So he releases the prisoners, and they try again to make themselves the new Sultan. All of them lose, and the guy who wins is very unhappy with the Byzantines for inconveniencing him like that, and he attacks Constantinople. It's like a yo-yo. Things are looking pretty grim again. John VII is dead at this point, so Manuel leaves his son John VIII in charge of Constantinople to go tour Europe again on the off chance anybody's feeling generous. Manuel comes home with bad news. The leaders of Europe were thrilled to host the Roman emperor at their court, and they gave him all kinds of lovely gifts and knickknacks and goodie bags, but none of them offered any real help. John VIII has some bad news too. Constantinople survived the siege, but John VIII couldn't defend Thessalonica. So he gives it to the Venetians out of spite. The Venetians of all people! If the Byzantine emperor hates you more than the people responsible for the Fourth Crusade, that is a low blow. Manuel tells his son he's done everything he can, spent his whole life fighting to protect his country, and just before he dies, he tells John to give up hope. Europe will not help them. But John VIII can't give up. He has to hope against hope that someone, somewhere, will come to his aid the next time the Ottomans attack. He took a journey to Italy in search of assistance, and no one cared. They had their own things going on. The only bright spot in the Byzantine Empire wasn't even in Constantinople. John VIII's brother, Constantine XI, was in charge of the Morea, and it was doing pretty well for itself. It was building new churches, new monasteries, new mansions. It was home to the arts and sciences, and it had that big wall to protect it from the world. Just like Constantinople was the new Rome, there was a sense that maybe the future for the Byzantines would be as the new Sparta. Let the Morea be the center of their empire. They would be small but tough, rugged and sturdy. And as any good Spartan would do, Constantine went to war with Athens. Athens was controlled by another Ottoman vassal, but Constantine was hoping that since the Ottomans were fighting a war with at least half of Eastern Europe, that they wouldn't really notice if one of their vassals took a little bit of land from another one of their vassals. And it was a big success. The people of Athens were quite happy to pay tribute to the Byzantines instead of the Ottomans, but the timing couldn't have been worse. The King of Poland really beansed the war against the Ottomans, and it ended way faster than Constantine was expecting. The Sultan suddenly had nothing else on his calendar and was very aware of Constantine's little trick. He crushed the wall protecting the Morea to rubble and ran through the entire region, ransacking Constantine's new Sparta. The Byzantines were left to rule over the ashes. Back to John VIII. He's throwing everything against the wall to see what sticks, and he's come up with one more idea. The whole converting to Catholicism thing that John V had tried seemed to earn him maybe just the tiniest bit of goodwill. So John goes to Italy and promises the Pope he is going to convert the entire Byzantine Empire, which really isn't that much at this point, to Catholicism. Somehow. He'll figure out how later. The Byzantine Empire wasn't even that many people at this point, but it's a big gesture. He spends almost 2 years hashing out all of the details of what the new unified church will look like. And when he returns to Constantinople, having won the favor of the West that could save his empire, his own people hate him, because he did kind of poo-poo their entire religion. But his brother Constantine agreed. Once, Constantinople was a city that watched over the whole world. If sacrificing the independence of their church meant the world will now watch over them, it will be worth it. John died in 1448. Instead of being crowned by the Patriarch of Constantinople like every other Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI was crowned as quietly as possible in the Morea. The Ottoman Sultan died in 1451 and was replaced by Constantine's greatest foe, Mehmed the Conqueror. Constantine tries to threaten Mehmed with releasing one of his political prisoners, but Mehmed has been looking for any excuse to start a war, and he just found it. Mehmed was an enormous Alexander the Great fanboy, and his only goal in life is to take over Constantinople. He builds a new fortress, not right across the water, but right next to Constantinople, and he calls it the Throat Slitter, because he's a theater kid in his heart, man. Constantine is the first to declare war, and it's game on. Constantine sends letters to the leaders of Europe, telling them this was his people's hour of need. This is the moment for which his brother had sacrificed his people's church and their way of life. The Roman Empire, mother of Europe, was in her final hours, and unless Europe assembled a new crusade, a fleet of thousands to arrive in the city's golden harbor, one of the holiest sites of Christendom, would fall. The Venetians sent a few guys to help because the Ottomans blew up one of their ships, and that was all. That was it. A city built for 15 million people had only 50,000 souls inside to defend it. They still had the walls, but they were not made for gunpowder. The Ottomans brought their cannons to bear on the Byzantines, including one of the largest cannons ever built in all of recorded history. This thing was so big, it took 90 oxen and 400 men to drag it into position. And it was so powerful, it killed some of the men who fired it. It could only be fired like 3 times a day because it overheated so frequently, and it fell apart within 6 weeks. But the showmanship was unparalleled. But it wasn't cannons that brought down Constantinople. The city's fall was at the hands of human error. Somebody left one of the gates open, In the middle of the most dire siege since the founding of Rome. Ottomans ran inside. Game over. Civilians were captured. People tried to escape dressing up as monks or slaves, but to no avail. Mehmed promised he would take the city one way or another, and if it wasn't handed to him full, he would take it empty. Constantine the 11th was told to flee the brewing carnage, to escape to the Morea and rule thence. But the emperor was still. He reached for his sword, and with his final words, here paraphrased, he stepped into battle. Once, this city mastered the entire universe. She placed beneath her feet Pontus, Armenia, Numidia, Italy, Ethiopia, Spain, Phoenicia, Arabia, Mesopotamia, the lands of the Celts and the Amazonians. Our empire, presently humbled, did fell the walls of Carthage, rival the Parthians and Sassanids, repel the savage Huns, slay the Bulgars, see the Seljuks return to dust, tame the wild Mongols, and cast out the Latins. If she is now, finally, to be devoured by the house of Osman, then as my city falls, I will fall with her.